He never expected his quiet morning at Ironwood Farmers Market to expose one of the largest corrupt criminal empires in American history. When 5 members of the notorious Hellfire Riders motorcycle gang decided to harass the overweight farmer, they had no idea they were messing with one of the military's most lethal combat specialists. Walter Hayes was a retired Delta Force commander, a man who had seen and survived the worst of the world's wars, hiding his true identity behind the facade of a simple local farmer. The weight he'd gained wasn't to disguise, it was just what happened after leaving the military. When Viper and his Hellfire Riders decided to harass the fat farmer at the town's weekly market, they thought they'd found an easy target. Instead, they set into motion a chain of events that would dismantle their corrupt criminal empire and teach these bikers a lesson they'd never forget. Before we continue with the story, tell us where you're watching from. If you like this story, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications because tomorrow we have a special story for you. Ironwood, Wyoming, a small town mostly known for its rustic charm, long, winding roads, and a population that had lived in its peaceful rhythm for generations. People moved here to escape the noise of city life, to live simply, and for many of them, to never leave. But life in Ironwood was about to be forever changed. Walter Hayes had lived in Ironwood for the past 15 years. He had bought a small farm on the outskirts of town after retiring from the military. His life, for the most part, had been peaceful. He spent his days tending to his crops, raising livestock, and living in a modest house just outside the town's limits. Most folks in Ironwood didn't think much of him. He was just another farmer, a quiet, middle-aged man with a slight belly from too many years of comfort and a steady, calm demeanor. But they didn't know Walter's story. They didn't know the man he had once been. An elite Delta Force commander, trained to handle the worst situations the world could throw at him. Walter had been to hell and back in his younger years. The scars, both physical and mental, had been buried under years of hard work and a quiet life. Walter had learned to leave his past behind. But the past had a way of resurfacing when you least expected it. It all started on a sunny Saturday morning at the Ironwood Farmers Market. It was a day like any other, with vendors lined up along the central street, selling fresh produce, handmade goods, and local crafts. Families walked from stall to stall, chatting with friends, enjoying the peaceful, easygoing atmosphere. Walter had set up his usual stall, offering fresh eggs, vegetables, and homemade jams. His table was modest, but his products were always fresh. He greeted customers with a nod and a quiet smile, content in his simple life. But things were about to change. It started with a loud roar. The sound of motorcycles echoed down Main Street, cutting through the quiet morning like a knife. Walter looked up from his stall, squinting against the sun as a group of bikers rolled into the market, their engines growling as they parked in front of the vendors. They were rough-looking men, all clad in leather jackets and tattoos, their faces hard, their eyes filled with arrogance. The Hellfire Riders. Walter recognized them instantly. They were a local gang that had been causing trouble in Ironwood for a few months now. Small-time thugs who made their money off extortion and intimidation. Walter had heard the whispers in town. The gang was moving in on Ironwood, trying to set up operations and take control of the area. They'd been pushing people around, bullying local businesses, and making the townsfolk uneasy. But Walter had always kept to himself, far away from the trouble. He had no interest in the gang's dealings. He didn't need to be involved. Until today, the bikers swaggered through the market like they owned the place, their loud voices and harsh laughter drowning out the peaceful sounds of the town. Walter looked down, his fingers tightening around the jar of homemade jam he was arranging on his table. His heart rate picked up ever so slightly. He didn't like the way they looked at the vendors, their sneers, their condescending glances. It was clear they were looking for trouble. One of the bikers, a tall man with a thick, scruffy beard and a patch on his leather jacket that read Viper, walked up to Walter's stall. He looked down at the jars of jam, then back at Walter, his eyes narrowing with amusement. "Nice little stand you've got here, old man," Viper said, his voice rough, laced with a sneer. "But I bet you're not making a lot of money off these. Not unless you're paying someone to keep things quiet around here." Walter kept his hands steady on the table, keeping his eyes focused on the jars in front of him. I'm not interested in whatever you're selling, friend. I'm just here to sell my goods. If you want something, you can buy it. Otherwise, move along." Viper chuckled, stepping closer to the table, leaning over it so that his face was mere inches from Walter's. "You think you can just ignore us? We're here to make sure everyone plays nice. And you? You look like the kind of guy who could use some convincing." The other bikers were beginning to circle the stall now, blocking the path for any other customers who might have wanted to buy from Walter. The heat from the biker gang was starting to build, and Walter could feel his muscles tense under the pressure. The moment was approaching when he would have to decide: stand down and let them walk all over him, or fight back. But these bikers had no idea who they were dealing with. They were about to learn the hard way that Walter Hayes wasn't the soft, lazy farmer they assumed he was. They were about to learn that when you push the wrong man, even a retired soldier with years of battle behind him could be pushed too far. The tension in the air was thick, almost suffocating. Walter's fingers curled into fists, hidden beneath the table. His mind flicked back to the days when he was a young soldier, a part of something far bigger than this sleepy town. He'd faced war zones, enemy combatants, and death itself. But nothing had ever felt quite as infuriating as this. Viper's eyes gleamed with mockery, unaware that his taunts were pushing Walter to the edge. The biker leaned even closer, his breath hot and unpleasant against Walter's skin. "You think you're untouchable?" Viper said, chuckling under his breath. "Maybe it's time we remind you who runs things around here." Walter didn't move a muscle, but inside, he could feel the years of restraint crack like dry wood splintering. He had lived quietly. He had avoided confrontation, choosing the peace of his farm over the chaos of his past. But these men, these cowards, had overestimated their power. "Step away," Walter said quietly, his voice steady but sharp. Viper paused, clearly amused by Walter's calm. "What's that? You want me to leave? Maybe you want me to buy something from your little market first. I'm thinking you'll sell me the whole damn stand." Walter's jaw clenched. He could already feel the rise of anger. His past as a soldier, as a trained killer, bubbled to the surface. The quiet life he had worked so hard to build was now in jeopardy because of these men who saw only weakness in people like him. "I said step away." This time, Walter's voice was louder, carrying the weight of authority. Viper's amusement faltered, but he quickly recovered. "Who do you think you're talking to, old man?" Without warning, Viper grabbed the jar of jam from Walter's table, slamming it down onto the ground in front of him. The glass shattered, sending shards of broken jar and sticky jam splattering across the ground. The gang behind him laughed. The sound of their laughter pierced Walter's calm. He stood up slowly, his movements deliberate. His eyes never left Viper's face. "I warned you," Walter said softly. In a blink, his hand shot out, grabbing the biker by the throat and slamming him against the market stall. The entire market froze. The other bikers stopped in their tracks, eyes wide in disbelief. They hadn't expected this from the fat farmer, the man who they thought was nothing more than a target. But Walter was far from that. Viper struggled against Walter's grip, gasping for air, his hands trying and failing to pry Walter's fingers from his throat. "You," Walter growled, his voice low and terrifying, "are not in charge here." He tightened his grip just a little, enough to make Viper's eyes widen in fear. "You think you can just walk into my town, destroy my things, and bully people into submission?" Viper's face turned red as he gasped for air, his muscles shaking. His gang watched in stunned silence, but Walter could see the hesitation in their eyes now. They were realizing that this wasn't the easy target they had thought it was. Walter's fingers flexed once, then twice, just enough to remind Viper that he was no longer the one in control. The biker's struggles weakened, his breath coming in short, frantic bursts. And then, just when Viper's hands had gone limp, Walter released him. Viper crumpled to the ground, gasping for air, his face pale and his hands clutching his throat as if he couldn't believe what had just happened. The market had gone deathly quiet. The few onlookers, who had been too afraid to get involved, were now murmuring among themselves. Walter took a step back, his hands still trembling, but not from fear, from the rage that had nearly consumed him. "You made a mistake," Walter said, his voice dangerously calm. "And you're going to regret it. Now, I suggest you take your friends and get out of here before I make you regret it even more." Viper's eyes glowed with venom as he struggled to catch his breath, but he didn't dare move. The sight of Walter, standing tall, firm, unyielding, was enough to make the bikers second-guess their bravado. They had come for a fight, but they hadn't expected a fight like this. "Let's get out of here," one of the bikers muttered, his voice low, unwilling to challenge the calm authority Walter had just displayed. Viper glanced at his gang, realizing they were all backing away. His pride had been shattered in an instant, and his gang wasn't about to stand by and watch him humiliated. Slowly, they turned and walked away, leaving the market in stunned silence. Walter watched them go, his chest rising and falling with the effort of controlling the anger that still burned within him. He didn't want to fight. He didn't want to hurt anyone, but these men had pushed him too far, and now they knew better than to underestimate him. As the bikers disappeared into the distance, Walter took a slow, deep breath. His calm exterior returned, but he couldn't ignore the rush of adrenaline that had surged through him moments before. His hands were still shaking, but it wasn't just from the confrontation. It was the reminder of the man he used to be, the soldier who had been trained to kill, to survive, to end battles before they even started. He had let his guard down for so many years, tucked away in his quiet life. But this was a wake-up call. He wasn't just some old farmer. He had skills. He had training. And if anyone ever tried to come after his town again, they would learn exactly what those skills could do. Walter turned to the few onlookers who were still around, watching him with a mixture of awe and fear. He wiped his hands on his pants and spoke softly. "Don't worry about them. They won't be back. Not unless they want more of the same." The town had witnessed something that none of them had ever imagined. They had seen the old man at the market stand, the fat farmer, put an end to a dangerous gang's intimidation in a matter of seconds. And from that day forward, they would look at Walter Hayes and Ironwood differently. The events at the market spread like wildfire throughout Ironwood. It wasn't every day a quiet, middle-aged farmer stood up to a group of bikers and put them in their place. Walter Hayes, once known as a simple farmer, now became a legend, though it wasn't the kind of reputation he was looking for. In the following hours, whispers spread throughout town. Some were in awe of what Walter had done. Others were afraid. No one really knew who Walter Hayes was, not truly. Not until now. And for some, the knowledge of what he was capable of was unsettling. Walter didn't care about the rumors. He'd spent too many years hiding in plain sight, avoiding the conflicts of the outside world. He wanted nothing more than to keep his farm running and live his life in peace. But peace, it seemed, was something that couldn't be bought with silence. As evening fell, Walter was back at his farm, tending to his animals, his hands methodically working with the familiar tools of his trade. The roar of engines had long since faded from the market square, but the tension lingered, thick and heavy. He knew that the bikers wouldn't just walk away without consequences. They never did. A sharp knock on the door broke Walter's concentration. He wiped his hands on his apron and walked across the creaky floorboards of his farmhouse to answer it. Standing on his doorstep was Sheriff Roland Briggs, a man Walter had known for years, but who now looked at him with a mix of respect and wariness. "I heard about what happened this morning," Sheriff Briggs said, his voice steady but carrying an undercurrent of concern. "Mind if I come in?" Walter nodded and stepped aside to let the sheriff in. He gestured toward a chair at the kitchen table, and Briggs took a seat. The sheriff wasn't a stranger to Walter's past. He had been one of the few who knew about Walter's military history, though Walter had kept the full extent of his service under wraps. "You've stirred up a hornet's nest, Walter," Briggs said, his voice gruff but calm. "Those bikers, they're a part of something bigger than you realize. They don't take kindly to being embarrassed." Walter leaned against the counter, arms crossed, his eyes steady. "I'm not interested in starting a war, Roland. But those men weren't just bikers. They were bullies. And when they crossed the line, I made sure they understood that." The sheriff's eyes softened. "I know, Walter. I know. But you can't forget that the Hellfire Riders, the group that runs those men, they've been moving into the area. They're not just a bunch of rowdy drunks. They're part of a much bigger operation. Their reach extends far beyond Ironwood. Walter's gaze darkened. He'd heard the rumors. Hellfire Riders weren't just outlaws on motorcycles. They were a criminal empire that ran everything from extortion and theft to drug trafficking and even murder. But to Walter, they were nothing more than a threat. And threats were something he knew how to handle. "They won't be back," Walter said flatly, his voice calm but filled with a promise. "Not unless they want to deal with me again." Sheriff Briggs studied him carefully. "You've got skills, Walter. We all know that. But those bikers are part of something much larger than a simple gang. They're connected to organized crime in the region, and if you think you've seen the worst of them, you're wrong. These people won't just walk away. They'll come for you. And they'll come for Ironwood." Walter's mind raced. He had retired from the life of a soldier for a reason. He had buried those years in his past, never wanting to bring that violence to a place like Ironwood. But he couldn't pretend anymore. The bikers had made it clear that they weren't going to leave, and now they had given Walter no choice. He wasn't going to run. He wasn't going to hide. Ironwood was his home, and he'd defend it just as fiercely as he had defended his country all those years ago. "I'm not running," Walter said, his voice calm but filled with purpose. "I'm going to finish this, before they think they can take anything else from this town." Sheriff Briggs hesitated before answering, his eyes narrowed. "You've got a lot of people here who trust you, but you can't do this alone. You'll need help. A lot of it." Walter turned toward the window, staring out over his farm. The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the fields. He knew what he had to do, and he knew he couldn't do it alone. Ironwood needed to stand together. If the Hellfire Riders thought they could just take over this town, they were about to learn a lesson in what happens when they push the wrong person. "You're right," Walter said, his voice low and firm. "I can't do this alone, but I don't need an army. I need the people who care about this town, and that's enough." By the following day, Walter had already begun to prepare. The bikers had made a mistake by crossing him, and now he was going to make sure they regretted it. He wasn't going to wait for them to make the next move. The clock was ticking, and the Hellfire Riders were going to pay for underestimating the quiet farmer they thought they could push around. He called on Sheriff Briggs, who had already started organizing a network of town residents who were willing to stand with Walter. Word spread quickly. The farmers, the shopkeepers, the townsfolk, all of them knew they had to stand together. Ironwood had always been a town of hard workers and simple folk, but now they would have to be something more. They were going to need to defend their homes, their families, and their way of life. Walter had fought wars before, but this time, the battle would be different. This wasn't about killing enemies on foreign soil. This was about defending everything he had built from the ground up. He gathered a group of local veterans, farmers, and families, all of them willing to take a stand. They would arm themselves, make a plan, and be ready. Walter wasn't just going to take on the Hellfire Riders. He was going to take on the whole criminal empire they had built and bring it to its knees. As Walter stood at the head of the table in the old community hall, his voice steady and commanding, he looked out at the group that had gathered. He saw fear in their eyes, but also something stronger, resolve. "We're not just defending this town," Walter said, his voice cutting through the tension in the room. "We're defending our homes, our families, our future. The Hellfire Riders think they can come here and take what we've built. They're wrong. And I'm going to make sure they never forget it." Walter Hayes had never been one for speeches. He wasn't the kind of man who stood in front of a crowd and rallied them with words. But when he spoke in the community hall, his voice carried weight, as if the very soil of Ironwood had absorbed his years of service and hardened him into something far beyond the simple farmer the town had once known him as. He stood tall at the head of the room, the tension palpable in the air. The faces before him, rough men and women, some farmers, some veterans, others who had lived in Ironwood all their lives, looked at him with a mix of fear, respect, and determination. They weren't sure what was coming, but they knew one thing. Walter wasn't asking them to fight. He was telling them they had to. The room was silent for a moment as Walter let his words sink in. The weight of his past hung heavy in the air, but the townsfolk weren't concerned with the man he had once been. They cared about the man standing in front of them now. An ally, a protector, a leader. "All right," Walter continued, his voice calm but strong. "Here's how we're going to do this. We'll need every hand we can get. We're not going to fight the Hellfire Riders head-on. Not yet. We'll do this smart. We'll hit their supply lines, take out their lookouts, and make sure we take away their ability to communicate. We need to leave them blind and scrambling." He paused, scanning the room. Each person, from the burly veteran to the quiet farmer, was watching him intently, waiting for further instructions. "We'll work in small teams," Walter continued. "One group will hit their supply drop-offs on the north side. Another group will monitor their movements around town, figure out who's running the show and where their leadership is. The rest of you will help get things set up here. We'll need to be able to defend Ironwood when the time comes." Joe Briggs, the sheriff, stepped forward, looking at Walter with a nod of agreement. "We've got enough rifles for everyone who's willing to fight. Some of the men here are ex-military, so they'll know what to do. The women and the families will help with logistics, keeping our people informed, helping get supplies, and staying out of harm's way." Walter nodded back. "We'll keep it quiet. No noise, no big showdowns. I know the Hellfire Riders. They won't hesitate to make this personal, so we're not going to give them the chance. We strike fast, we hit hard, and we disappear before they can retaliate." "Sounds like a plan," Joe said. "But what about the leadership? We can't just cripple their supply lines. We need to take their command out." Walter let out a low breath. "We'll save that for last. If we hit them hard enough, they'll be scrambling for their leadership. That's when we move in for the kill." The days that followed were filled with action. Walter's plan took shape quickly. The townspeople were pulling together, working harder than they ever had before. The farmers, the veterans, and even some of the younger folks who had never been involved in a fight before were all preparing for the war that was now coming to their doorstep. Walter could feel the tension in the air as the town worked around the clock. Small teams moved in and out of Ironwood, scouting the bikers' movements, gathering intel, and disrupting their operations at every turn. Supplies were intercepted. Lookouts were neutralized. The Hellfire Riders, confident in their strength, had no idea that Ironwood was readying itself for a fight. Walter stayed behind the scenes, leading the effort with quiet authority. He checked in on each team's progress, ensuring that everyone remained safe and stayed out of sight. The longer they could keep the riders guessing, the better. But even as Walter took solace in the success of their small operations, he knew that this would not be over until the leadership of the Hellfire Riders was taken out. Their commanding officers were the linchpin of their power, and if Ironwood was to be truly free, they needed to go. It was early one morning when Walter's scout team brought in critical information. The Riders were making a move. The leadership was getting ready to meet at a local hideout on the outskirts of Ironwood. Walter wasted no time, quickly gathering his most trusted men and women for the operation. He addressed the group at the barn, the flickering light from the oil lamps casting long shadows across their faces. "This is it," Walter said. "We've disrupted their supplies, we've made them scatter, and now they'll be looking for answers. But we can't let them regroup. We're going to hit them fast and hit them hard. We'll take their leaders and make sure they never come back." Joe Briggs stepped forward, his hand on the rifle slung over his shoulder. "We've trained for this, Walter. The Riders won't know what hit him. This is our chance to take them out before they can retaliate." Walter met his eyes, steady. "Exactly. We don't have time to waste. Once we go in, we don't stop until we've taken their leadership down." The mission was set in motion at dusk. Walter's team, split into smaller groups, moved out toward the hideout where the Hellfire Riders' leadership was believed to be meeting. Every man and woman was armed, the weight of the rifles and handguns steadying their nerves. They moved like shadows, silent and invisible, making their way toward the abandoned warehouse where the Riders had set up shop. Walter's heart beat in his chest like a drum, but his hands were steady. The men around him had been through their fair share of battles, and they knew what was at stake. This wasn't just a fight for Ironwood anymore. This was a fight for control over their town, their future, and their lives. They reached the warehouse without incident, the darkened silhouette of the building looming ahead. Walter's mind sharpened, recalling the tactics that had once kept him alive in far worse situations. His plan was simple, but effective. Surround them, hit them with everything they had, and cut off any escape routes. The first shots rang out in the silence of the night, quick and efficient. The riders were caught off guard, and before they could react, Walter's team was inside, taking down their command structure with precision. Walter moved like a man who had seen the worst the world had to offer, but now he was fighting for something worth more than any battle he had fought before. Ironwood, his people, his home. And as the last of the riders' leaders fell to the ground, Walter knew that the battle had been won. The riders' empire was crumbling, and Ironwood was no longer just a town. It was a symbol of resistance. The warehouse was silent except for the faint crackling of fire from a nearby barrel and the occasional shuffle of boots on concrete. Walter stood over the fallen bodies of the Hellfire Riders' leaders, his breath steady but his eyes scanning the surroundings for any sign of danger. The operation had been swift, and they'd hit harder than anyone had expected. But Walter knew this wasn't the end. He turned to Joe Briggs, who was checking the perimeter. "They're done," Walter said, his voice low but commanding. "The heart of their operation is gone, but we need to move quickly. They'll know we're here now." Joe nodded, signaling to the others to secure the area. "What about the rest of their crew? There's got to be more out there." "We'll deal with them," Walter replied, his eyes narrowing. "For now, we get back to Ironwood. We don't want to overstay our welcome here." The group moved efficiently, loading up the bikes and taking the stolen weapons they had secured as evidence. The job was far from over, but it was a significant blow to the riders. Walter couldn't shake the feeling that something was still looming. The way the riders operated, always organized, always moving, made him think that this was just the beginning. As they returned to Ironwood, Walter found himself once again thinking about the quiet life he'd built here. It felt like a lifetime ago when he had arrived, seeking peace after the chaos of war. But life had a funny way of drawing you back into the fight, especially when someone like the Hellfire Riders decided they could take what they wanted. By the time they arrived back in Ironwood, the town had already started to stir. The word had spread about the takedown of the Riders' leadership, and the town was cautiously optimistic. People walked with their heads held higher, a sense of pride and relief flooding the streets. The heavy hand of the Hellfire Riders that had hovered over Ironwood for months was suddenly lifted. But as Walter entered the town square, he saw the sheriff's office door open, and Sheriff Briggs stepped out, his face grim. Walter's stomach tightened. Something wasn't right. "We've got a problem," Joe said, his voice low. Walter stopped in his tracks. "What's happened?" "Word from the other towns," Joe said, glancing nervously at the group behind Walter. "They're mobilizing. The riders, what's left of them, are calling in reinforcements. It looks like we've stirred the hornet's nest." Walter's fists clenched. He had known it wouldn't be easy, but he hadn't expected it to escalate so quickly. The riders weren't just a gang. They were a part of something much larger. They had connections, and if the group had any brains left, they would retaliate with everything they had. "I don't care how many of them there are," Walter said, his voice cutting through the tension in the air. "We fight. We finish what we started." Joe gave him a steady look. "It's not just about fighting anymore, Walter. They're bigger than us. We've made them bleed, but they've got resources. They've got allies. They'll come for us harder than ever before." "I don't care," Walter repeated. "I'm not running from them. Ironwood's my home, and if they want it, they'll have to take it from my cold, dead hands." Joe sighed and nodded, but there was a heaviness in his eyes that Walter couldn't ignore. The people in this town had been through enough. They had put their trust in him, and now he couldn't let them down. They couldn't just survive anymore. They had to fight, and they had to win. Over the next few days, Walter worked with Joe to fortify Ironwood. Every building was reinforced. Every street corner was watched. The remaining members of the Hellfire Riders had scattered, but Walter knew they wouldn't be gone for long. They would regroup, and when they did, they would bring everything they had. Walter called a meeting with the town's leaders in the community hall. He stood before the gathered people, his eyes scanning the room. Every face before him was one he knew. These were his neighbors, his friends, and they were about to become soldiers, whether they were ready for it or not. "This is it," Walter began, his voice calm but filled with urgency. "We've made a statement, but the fight isn't over. The Hellfire Riders won't stop just because we've taken their leaders. They're coming back, and when they do, We need to be ready. We'll stand together. Ironwood will not fall." The room was filled with murmurs of agreement. Some faces were filled with fear, others with determination. But all of them knew Walter was right. They had fought for survival this far. Now, they would fight for the future. "We're not just defending this town," Walter continued, his voice strong. "We're sending a message. We've already hit them hard. Now, we finish it. We don't stop until they know that Ironwood is untouchable. And that starts with all of us. We fight for each other." Joe stood beside him, nodding in agreement. "We've got the means, we've got the numbers, and we've got the will. The Riders think they can walk over us. We'll show them what happens when they mess with Ironwood." Walter's eyes scanned the room, locking onto each individual, seeing the resolve building in their eyes. This wasn't just about fighting a gang. It was about fighting for the survival of Ironwood and everything it stood for. As the days wore on, the preparations grew more intense. Walter spent hours with his crew, teaching them how to handle weapons, how to defend the town, and how to fight like the soldiers they never thought they would be. The women of Ironwood became just as integral to the defense as the men. Some worked on fortifications, while others ran supplies, prepared meals, and helped to organize communication. The Hellfire Riders weren't just some ragtag group of bikers anymore. They were a network of criminals with connections to some of the most dangerous people in the region. Walter knew that the Riders would stop at nothing to take back control. But Ironwood was ready, and when the Riders came, they would have no idea what hit them. The days leading up to the inevitable clash were tense. Ironwood was a town transformed. The atmosphere that had once been filled with the casual hum of rural life was now charged with a sense of purpose. Every resident, from the oldest to the youngest, knew that their lives were about to change. The Hellfire Riders had made a fatal mistake in underestimating Walter Hayes, and now, the town had only one option left: to fight. Walter had kept a low profile in the days following the meeting. He spent his time overseeing the final preparations, checking the defenses, ensuring that everyone knew their roles, and making sure the community remained tight-knit. The townspeople had come together in a way that was almost inspiring. Everyone had a role to play, and for once, Walter felt the weight of leadership settle comfortably on his shoulders. This was what he had been trained for, the very thing he had run from all those years ago. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, the last of the barricades had been built. The rifle teams were set, the lookouts were posted, and the families had been briefed. The silence in the town was nearly unbearable, but Walter could feel the collective heartbeat of Ironwood. Everyone knew what was coming, and everyone was ready. Walter stood at the edge of the farm, looking toward the distant hills. The peace he had once sought here now felt like a fleeting memory, replaced by the reality of war. His fingers gently brushed the hilt of his knife, the weapon that had saved his life countless times before. It was a reminder of the man he had been, a man forged by years of conflict. But that man was no longer a ghost in the shadows. He was the protector of this town, and he would fight for it with everything he had. The silence was broken when Joe Briggs approached, his silhouette casting a long shadow under the fading light. "You sure about this?" Joe asked, his voice low and steady. Walter didn't hesitate. "There's no other choice, Joe. Ironwood stands or it falls. And if it falls, then everything we've worked for, everything we've built, will be gone. The Riders won't stop until they've got this town under their thumb. And I won't let that happen." Joe nodded, his face hardening with determination. "I'm with you, Walter. The town's with you. We fight for this." Walter met his gaze, a brief flicker of pride in his eyes. "We do this together. We show them what happens when they mess with Ironwood." The following morning came too quickly. The town was on high alert as the first rays of sunlight painted the sky in shades of orange and pink. The sounds of boots on dirt, the rustling of rifles being checked and rechecked, and the murmurs of whispered conversations filled the air. Ironwood was ready, but so were the Hellfire Riders. Walter had gathered his crew by the old water tower, the best vantage point in town. From here, they could see the surrounding hills and the road that led into Ironwood. It was there that the Riders would likely make their move. Walter's heart beat faster as he surveyed the horizon, knowing that this was it, the moment they had all been waiting for. "Everyone's in position?" Walter asked, his voice sharp but controlled. Joe Briggs nodded. "We've got scouts on the edge of town. The women and children are safe in the underground bunkers, and the rest of us are ready to fight." Walter scanned the faces of his team. Veterans, farmers, townsfolk, all of them standing shoulder to shoulder. These weren't soldiers. They were neighbors, people who had never asked for war but had found themselves caught in it all the same. And they weren't going to back down. "I'm counting on each and every one of you," Walter said, his voice carrying the weight of leadership. "When they come, we don't wait. We hit them fast, hit them hard, and we make sure they know Ironwood isn't theirs to take." The first sound they heard wasn't the roar of motorcycles. It was the faintest sound of tires on gravel. Walter's eyes narrowed as he scanned the road. The riders were coming, but they weren't riding in a massive convoy. Instead, they were using small groups, likely in an attempt to avoid detection, to spread out and ambush the town. "Here they come," Walter said, his voice tight with focus. The moment the first biker came into view, Walter signaled to his crew. They moved swiftly and silently, like shadows merging with the earth itself. Walter's heart raced, but his mind was calm, focused on the task at hand. They were ready for this. The sound of motorcycles grew louder as the Hellfire Riders moved closer. Walter's fingers clenched around his rifle, his breath steady as the world seemed to slow around him. He could see the glint of leather jackets and the flash of tattoos. These were the men who had harassed his town, terrorized his neighbors. But today, they weren't the ones in control. The first biker rounded the corner of a nearby building, only to be met with the sound of gunfire. The shot was clean, precise, right through the engine, causing the motorcycle to sputter and stall. The biker was thrown off balance, hitting the ground hard. The riders retaliated quickly, but they were caught off guard. The men and women of Ironwood were faster, moving with the precision Walter had instilled in them. Gunfire rang out, sharp and purposeful, hitting their targets with lethal accuracy. Walter moved through the town with a calm intensity. He saw Joe Briggs in the distance, covering a flank with a rifle. The veteran teams had set up ambushes along the roads, and they were taking out riders one by one, forcing them into disarray. The riders had expected a simple, quick fight, but they hadn't counted on Ironwood's resolve. They were outnumbered, and they were losing ground. Walter's pulse quickened as he moved toward the next group of bikers. He knew they had no chance of victory. They were no longer a gang. They were a broken, scattered group, unable to keep up with the precision of Ironwood's defense. One biker, a man with a snake tattoo on his arm, raised his rifle, aiming for Walter. But Walter was faster. In one smooth motion, he dropped the biker with a single shot to the chest. The remaining bikers tried to retreat, but Walter and his crew had already surrounded them. They were trapped, and they knew it. Walter's eyes met one of the remaining riders, and the fear was unmistakable. "Get on your knees," Walter barked, his voice cold and unyielding. The biker dropped his rifle, raising his hands in surrender. Walter nodded to his team, and the riders were quickly disarmed, their bikes destroyed, their operations crippled. As the battle came to a close, Walter stood in the middle of the town square, breathing heavily but standing tall. Ironwood had done it. They had fought back and won. The Hellfire Riders, once the scourge of the region, were nothing more than a broken, scattered group of defeated men. The empire they had tried to build was in ruins, and Ironwood had emerged victorious. But as Walter stood there, surveying the aftermath, he knew that this battle, this victory, was just the beginning. The riders would regroup. The world would keep changing. But Ironwood, with its fierce resolve and unbreakable spirit, would stand strong. And Walter Hayes, the retired Delta Force commander turned farmer, would be there to protect it. The dust had barely settled in Ironwood when the first wave of consequences began to reveal itself. While the town celebrated their hard-fought victory over the Hellfire Riders, Walter knew this was far from the end. The Riders had been a significant threat, but they were also a symptom of a much larger issue, the criminal underworld that had been infiltrating the region. If they wanted true peace, they would need to deal with the root of the problem. Walter walked through the town square, surveying the aftermath. The townspeople were already cleaning up, helping each other repair the damage done to homes and businesses during the skirmish. It was a testament to the community that they were already moving forward, rebuilding what had been broken. Joe Briggs walked up beside him, his face etched with exhaustion. "Well, that went better than expected," Joe said, wiping a smear of dirt from his face. "But it's not over, is it?" Walter shook his head. "Not by a long shot. The riders were just the foot soldiers. We've got a bigger problem on our hands. The Hellfire Riders are connected to organized crime, people who don't just operate in small towns like ours. They control larger networks, and they won't let a little thing like defeat stop them." Joe looked over at the town, a frown crossing his face. "What are you suggesting, Walter?" "I'm suggesting that we need help. The riders might be beaten, but they're part of something much larger. We can't just wait around for them to regroup. We need to send a message. We need allies, people who can help us deal with the real problem." Joe crossed his arms, his eyes scanning the crowd of townsfolk. "I agree, but who's going to trust a small town like Ironwood? We don't exactly have the resources or the connections to take on a criminal empire." Walter's gaze hardened as he turned to face his old friend. "Then we make our own connections. We find the right people. We don't need to fight the whole empire at once. We just need to make sure we're not alone when the next wave comes." Walter spent the next few days contacting old contacts, men and women who had crossed his path during his time in the military, individuals who had access to resources and networks of people who were just as determined to see the criminals rooted out as he was. It wasn't long before Walter found his first ally, a former Special Forces colleague named Marcus Bishop, a man who had gone into private security after his time in the military. Bishop had connections in some of the more unsavory corners of the world, but had always operated on the side of justice. Walter arranged to meet him in a nearby town, a place called Bitter Creek, a 2-hour ride from Ironwood. Walter had a feeling that Marcus would understand exactly what was at stake, and if anyone could help Ironwood, it would be him. The ride to Bitter Creek was long and uneventful, just the kind of ride Walter had come to appreciate. He found solace in the hum of his motorcycle, the rhythmic pulse of the engine keeping his mind clear as the landscape passed by. There was something grounding about the road, something that allowed him to think, to focus. As he approached Bitter Creek, the air grew heavier. The town was a little larger than Ironwood, but had the same quiet, hardscrabble vibe. It was a town that didn't ask for trouble, but trouble had a way of finding it. Walter parked outside a small, run-down diner on the edge of town. It was the kind of place where people want to get a meal and forget their worries, or sometimes to make a deal without anyone noticing. He stepped inside and immediately saw Marcus sitting at a booth in the corner, his back to the wall, a cup of coffee in front of him. Marcus Bishop hadn't changed much since their days in the field. He was still as lean and sharp-eyed as ever, his face weathered by years of hard work and worse decisions. The man was no stranger to the darker side of life, but he was also someone Walter trusted implicitly. "Walter," Marcus greeted, standing up as Walter approached. "Good to see you, my friend." The two men shook hands firmly. Walter sat down across from Marcus, his gaze focused. "Ironwood's in trouble," Walter said without preamble. "The Hellfire Riders were just the beginning. We need help, more than we've got in town. I'm not asking you to come to Ironwood, but I need you to help me find the right people who can help us take on the bigger problem. I know the Riders aren't alone in this, and I need someone with your contacts." Marcus studied him for a long moment before answering. "I've heard about what happened in Ironwood. I know you've got the guts to take on anyone, but you're right. The Riders aren't the only players in this. The problem's deeper. If you're asking me to help you bring down a criminal empire, you're not going to like what's involved. It's going to get messy." Walter leaned forward, his voice low and determined. "I didn't come here to ask for an easy way out. I've fought my share of wars, Marcus. I'm ready to do whatever it takes." Marcus let out a slow breath, his eyes never leaving Walter's. "All right, you've got my attention. I'll see what I can do. I've got some contacts in the right places. But you're going to need more than just a couple of guys on the ground. If we're going after these people, we need intel, weapons, and resources." "I'm not asking for a war," Walter replied. "But if they want to make this personal, we'll give it to them." By the time Walter left Bitter Creek, he had a plan in motion. Marcus had made some calls, and within hours, the ball was rolling. A network of former military personnel, private security experts, and even a few law enforcement contacts would be joining their cause. It wasn't an army, but it was enough to give Walter hope that Ironwood wasn't alone in this fight. As he rode back to Ironwood, Walter felt a renewed sense of purpose. The town had already proven it could stand up to the Hellfire Riders, but now they had a chance to take down the entire network. The Riders were just a piece of the puzzle, a puzzle Walter had no intention of leaving unsolved. Ironwood wasn't just going to survive, it was going to fight back, and Walter Hayes was going to make sure it never had to live in fear again. Ironwood had taken its first major victory, but Walter knew that a single battle wasn't enough to secure their future. The Hellfire Riders had been a formidable force, but they weren't the only criminal network in the area. What worried Walter the most was the ripple effect. They had sent a strong message by taking down the Riders' leadership, but that hadn't wiped out the deeper problem. The Riders were part of something bigger, something with far-reaching ties. But with the help of Marcus Bishop and the contacts he had in the private security and military worlds, Walter felt a glimmer of hope. His team was growing, and so was Ironwood's resolve. They would take this fight to the heart of the criminal empire that had been poisoning the region, piece by piece. And Ironwood wouldn't just survive, it would stand as a fortress. Walter spent the next few days focusing on strengthening the town's defenses. The plan was simple: fortify Ironwood, make sure every citizen could defend themselves, and keep their heads down while they gathered more intel. But Walter knew that was just the beginning. They needed more resources, better strategies, and most importantly, better allies. His first move was to organize a meeting with the new contacts Marcus had provided. They were a diverse group: ex-soldiers, former police officers, even a few mercenaries who had seen the worst the world could throw at them. But what they all had in common was a shared understanding of justice, a belief that the innocent shouldn't suffer just because they were in the wrong place at the wrong time. Walter needed this group to come together, to train the people of Ironwood, and to help him put an end to the criminal empire once and for all. The day of the meeting, Walter stood in the town square, looking out over the crowd that had gathered. It was smaller than he'd hoped, but the people of Ironwood had come together. The fear was still there, lurking in the corners of their minds, but it was being replaced by something stronger: determination. This wasn't just Walter's fight anymore. It was their fight. Marcus stood next to him, giving the crowd a once-over. "We're not just fighting for Ironwood, Walter," he said. "We're fighting for the future of the whole region. If we stop here, we'll just invite the next group in. We've got to take the fight to them." Walter nodded, feeling the weight of his words. He knew Marcus was right. Ironwood was just one small town in a vast network of criminals and corrupt power. But Ironwood would stand as a beacon, a symbol that one town, one community, could push back against the darkness. The crowd slowly began to gather their weapons: rifles, handguns, even pitchforks. But there was a unified energy to the group. They weren't just a mob with weapons. They were a community determined to protect what they had. Walter could see the change in them. Ironwood was no longer just a quiet town on the map. It was becoming a force to be reckoned with. "All right," Walter called out, his voice cutting through the chatter. "You've all shown up for a reason. This town has had enough. The Hellfire Riders thought they could walk in here, shake us down, and take whatever they wanted. They were wrong. But this isn't over. We've made them bleed, but they'll regroup. And when they do, we'll be ready." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd, and Walter could feel the fire building inside them. "First things first," Walter continued. "We need to get organized. We've got military and law enforcement backgrounds in this town, and it's time to put that experience to use. We'll split into teams, one for intelligence, one for defense, and one for striking their supply routes. We don't wait for them to come to us. We go to them." The next several days were a blur of training and preparation. Walter had brought in the best people he could find: Marcus and his team, former military tacticians, and anyone with a practical skill that could help Ironwood. The town was becoming more than just a community of farmers and shopkeepers. It was turning into a military unit, with Walter as their leader. The intel they had gathered painted a clear picture. The Hellfire Riders weren't just local thugs. They were part of a vast operation spanning several counties, if not states. Their criminal ties ran deep, and while the group in Ironwood had been cut down, there were still pockets of the Riders everywhere. And those pockets would need to be crushed, one by one. Walter and Marcus sat in the war room, a room Walter had converted from an old storage shed on the outskirts of town. The walls were lined with maps, photos, and notes. It was a small space, but it felt like the command center of a much larger operation. The names and faces of the remaining leaders of the Hellfire Riders were pinned up on one wall, their positions and known connections sketched in detail. "I've got a lead on their main supply route," Marcus said, scanning the maps. "If we hit that, we can cut off a major source of their power. But we need to hit it hard, fast. If they get a chance to regroup, they'll make us regret it." Walter nodded, tracing the route on the map with his finger. "This is our opportunity. We hit them where it hurts, and we don't give them a chance to recover. The people of Ironwood will have to keep pushing forward. No turning back." "Agreed," Marcus said. "But we also need to make sure we're not drawing too much attention. If we overdo it, they'll know we're coming." Walter leaned back in his chair, his gaze fixed on the wall. "We make sure they don't know we're coming. And when we strike with everything we've got." Ironwood's first offensive was set into motion within days. Walter's team moved quickly, and though it was a small force, it was an organized one. They hit the Riders' supply routes, taking down small storage depots and cutting off supply lines that had been feeding their network. Walter's strategy was methodical, and every move was calculated to maximize damage while minimizing exposure. It wasn't long before the Hellfire Riders began to feel the pressure. Their supplies were dwindling, and their leadership was in chaos. But Walter knew that they wouldn't take this lying down. They were a criminal empire, and they wouldn't crumble so easily. The final battle was coming, and when it did, Ironwood would be ready. As the days passed, Walter could feel the weight of the fight bearing down on him. He had trained for combat, had led men through the worst of situations. But this was different. This wasn't a distant war where lives were lost on foreign soil. This was his home, his people, and the stakes were higher than they had ever been. But in the silence of the night, as Walter sat alone on his porch, looking out over the farm, he couldn't help but feel a glimmer of hope. They had already proven that they could fight. They had already shown that Ironwood was not a town to be ignored. And now, it was time to finish it. Walter's plan had been methodical, well-paced, well-calculated, and executed with precision. Each step had been taken with a clear objective: to cripple the Hellfire Riders' ability to move and regroup. Now, the small town of Ironwood was on the brink of what Walter knew would be the decisive moment. The Riders, their empire shattered, were no longer operating from a position of power. But that didn't mean they were finished. Far from it. The Riders, desperate and fractured, had already begun regrouping, but they were running out of time. Ironwood, with its newfound resolve and network of allies, had delivered devastating blows to their resources and supplies. The Riders had lost their ability to communicate, their weapons, and a large chunk of their cash flow. But they were far from finished, and they would come for Ironwood with everything they had left. Walter stood at the head of the makeshift war table in the town hall, his eyes scanning the map in front of him. The few remaining Riders had retreated to a nearby abandoned factory on the outskirts of Ironwood, fortified by what little reinforcements they had managed to scrape together. Walter knew that this factory was their last bastion of power, their final stronghold before they either collapsed or made a final, bloody stand. "All right, here's the deal," Walter said, his voice steady as the room filled with his makeshift army. Men and women who had never fired a weapon in their life now stood ready for battle. They weren't soldiers, but the stakes had changed. This wasn't about survival anymore. It was about taking the fight to the enemy. "We hit them fast, and we hit them hard. No hesitation. We take down their leadership, cut off any escape routes, and then make sure we leave no one standing. They think they've got the advantage because they've fortified themselves. We'll show them they're wrong." Joe Briggs stepped forward, a rifle slung over his shoulder. His face was grim, but his eyes held that familiar spark of resolve. "You don't need to tell us twice. We're ready. This is it." Walter nodded. "We've done everything we could to prepare. We've already neutralized their supply lines and cut off their ability to communicate. Now we end it." The room went quiet as Walter met the eyes of each person in the room. Ironwood wasn't just a town anymore. It was a family, a group of men and women who had chosen to stand together and fight for what they believed in. No one was backing down. The plan was simple. Walter and his most trusted men would move in from the north, taking out the sentries and securing the perimeter of the factory. Joe Briggs and the rest of the team would approach from the south, hitting the rear entrance and ensuring that the riders wouldn't be able to escape. The goal was not just to break their defenses, but to completely annihilate their ability to regroup and fight back. Every man and woman in Ironwood had a role to play, and Walter trusted them to execute it perfectly. By dusk, the town was as quiet as a ghost town. The streets were empty, save for the occasional shadow moving between buildings. Walter gathered his team, briefed them one last time, and sent them out. The tension in the air was palpable. It felt like the calm before the storm, but Walter wasn't nervous. He'd been through worse. This wasn't his first battle, but this one was personal. They approached the factory under the cover of night, moving silently through the overgrown fields. The factory loomed ahead, dark and foreboding. The place had once been the heart of Ironwood's industrial sector, but now it was little more than a decaying shell, a perfect hideout for a group of criminals who had nowhere else to go. But Ironwood wasn't about to let them make it their fortress. Walter signaled for his team to split up, each group taking their designated position. He moved with Joe Briggs toward the northern side of the factory, where a small group of riders had been stationed to watch the perimeter. The men were unaware of what was coming, too distracted by their false sense of security. They had no idea that the storm had already arrived. Walter's heart raced as he moved closer. His training kicked in. Every step was deliberate, every breath measured. He reached for his rifle, checking the scope, aligning his target with precision. With a swift motion, he took the first sentry out silently, a single shot through the neck. The man dropped without a sound. Joe moved quickly to cover the next sentry, neutralizing him in seconds. One by one, they took out the guards around the perimeter, moving like ghosts. Walter didn't allow himself the luxury of slowing down. He knew the riders wouldn't stay unaware for long. Every second they spent outside the factory was another moment that the enemy could react. Inside the factory, the remaining riders were beginning to feel the pressure. They were holed up, nervous, whispering among themselves about the sudden quiet. Their leader, a man named Rocco, had been the one to survive the chaos of the previous encounters with Ironwood. Rocco wasn't one to admit defeat, but the signs were clear. The riders had been cornered. "They're coming," one of the bikers muttered, his face pale as he watched through a dirty window. "We can't hold out here. They've got us surrounded." Rocco's eyes were dark with anger. "We don't run. We stand and fight. This town won't take us without a fight. We're Hellfire Riders. They don't get to walk in and take our turf." But as Rocco spoke, his voice full of defiance, deep down he knew that their time was running out. Walter Hayes wasn't just a man. He was a force, one that had broken the riders before and was going to do it again. And the rest of the riders knew it. Ironwood had already proven it had the will to fight back, and now it was time for the final blow. The attack on the factory was swift. The riders had barely started to organize a defense when the first explosion rocked the front gate, sending debris flying into the night. Walter and his crew charged in, weapons drawn, taking out the last few riders who hadn't yet surrendered. The chaos that followed was brutal, but it was quick. Rocco tried to make a stand, rallying the few men who still had the will to fight, but they were outnumbered and outgunned. In the end, it was Walter who confronted him, the two men locking eyes as Rocco raised his rifle. "This is over, Rocco," Walter said, his voice low but certain. "You lost, and now, you'll pay for everything you've done to this town." Rocco hesitated, his rifle shaking in his hands. He knew what was coming, but pride kept him from lowering his weapon. "I've got nothing left," he spat, his voice filled with venom. "You think you've won? This is just one battle. There are more of us out there. You can't kill all of us." Walter's expression didn't change. "I don't need to kill all of you. I just need to make sure you never hurt anyone again." With a sharp motion, Walter disarmed Rocco, taking the rifle from his hands before he could fire. The leader of the Hellfire Riders collapsed to his knees, his head hanging low in defeat. Walter stood over him for a moment, letting the silence speak louder than any words could. This wasn't about vengeance, it was about justice. By the time the sun began to rise over Ironwood, the The factory was quiet. The fight was over. The Hellfire Riders, their empire shattered, had been defeated. The town had come together, fought for its future, and had secured it. Ironwood had won, and Walter Hayes had proven, once and for all, that a quiet farmer, when pushed too far, could bring down an empire. Ironwood was silent the morning after the battle. The factory, once a symbol of power for the Hellfire Riders, now stood as a monument to the town's victory. But the victory felt bittersweet. Walter Hayes had seen countless battles, but this one, this fight for the town he had made his home, was different. It wasn't just about survival. It was about taking back control. The Riders were broken, their leadership wiped out, their stronghold destroyed. But Walter knew they weren't the last threat Ironwood would face. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. But for the first time in months, Ironwood was free from the shadow that had loomed over it. Walter stood at the edge of town, looking out at the horizon as the sun began to rise. The landscape was quiet, peaceful, but he knew that peace was fragile. There would always be more battles to fight, more criminals, more forces that would try to take what Ironwood had built. But for now, they had one, and that was enough. Joe Briggs approached, his boots crunching on the gravel as he walked up beside Walter. The sheriff's face was tired but relieved. "It's over," Joe said quietly, looking out over the town. "The Riders are gone. They won't be back." Walter nodded, his eyes still on the horizon. This town's paid a heavy price. But the people of Ironwood, they're stronger now. They know what they're capable of. Joe glanced at Walter, a knowing look in his eyes. "You've done something here, Walter. You didn't just fight for Ironwood. You brought the town together. And that's something no one can take away." Walter's gaze softened, but the weight of everything still hung heavy on his shoulders. "It wasn't just me. It was all of them. The people who stood with us, who fought beside us. They're the ones who made this happen." Joe gave him a firm nod, his expression shifting. "So what now? What's next for Ironwood?" Walter paused for a moment, the question hanging in the air. He had spent so long thinking of the battle ahead that he hadn't given much thought to what would come afterward. But the answer was clear. They rebuild. They build something stronger, something lasting, and they would never forget the lessons they'd learned. "We rebuild," Walter said finally. "Ironwood's not just a town. It's a community. We've proven we can stand up for ourselves. But now, we need to make sure we don't lose sight of why we fought. This is about protecting our future." Joe looked at him, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Sounds like you're already thinking ahead. Maybe you're right. But for today, we can rest. We've earned it." Walter didn't answer right away. He knew Joe was right. They had earned a moment of peace. But Walter also knew that peace was fleeting. The world didn't stop spinning just because they'd won one fight. The question was no longer whether Ironwood could survive. It was whether Ironwood could thrive. "Yeah," Walter said, his voice steady. "For today, we rest." Over the next few weeks, Ironwood began to rebuild. The people who had once lived in fear now walked with their heads held high, their pride restored. The market, once a place of tension and intimidation, became a symbol of Ironwood's resilience. Families returned to their businesses, their homes, and their lives, knowing they could never let down their guard but also understanding the strength that came with standing together. Walter spent his days working on the farm, keeping the town's defenses strong, and making sure the town continued to rebuild. He knew that Ironwood couldn't be complacent, but for the first time, he allowed himself to breathe. It wasn't over, but the battle had shifted. They had fought back, and they had won. That was something worth celebrating. One evening, as Walter sat on the porch of his farm, watching the sunset over the town, he thought back to when he first arrived in Ironwood. He had been broken, lost, searching for peace. But Ironwood had given him something he hadn't expected, a chance at redemption. It wasn't just the land or the quiet. It was the people. They had taught him what it meant to belong, to fight for something bigger than himself. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps. Joe Briggs walked up the driveway, a faint smile on his face. "Just wanted to check in on you, Walter," Joe said, taking a seat on the porch beside him. "How are you holding up?" Walter looked over at him, a half smile tugging at his lips. "I'm good, Joe. Just thinking." Joe raised an eyebrow. Thinking about what? Everything that's happened, Walter replied, his voice thoughtful. The riders, the fight, everything. It feels like a lifetime ago. But it wasn't just about defeating them. It was about showing everyone that Ironwood isn't just a place on the map. It's a place that stands. We've got a future here, Joe. Joe nodded, his eyes scanning the horizon. You're right. Ironwood's a lot more than a town now. It's a symbol. We've been through hell, but we're standing stronger than ever. Walter stood up and stretched, looking at Joe with a quiet resolve. We're not just standing, Joe. We're building. And I'm not done yet. Joe chuckled, rising to his feet as well. I don't think anyone in Ironwood doubts that. Months passed, and Walter's words proved true. Ironwood continued to grow, to build, to thrive. The people who had once been afraid now worked side by side, stronger than they had ever been. They built a community, not just a town, but a legacy. Walter knew that there would always be threats. There would always be forces looking to take what they had. But Ironwood was no longer a town that could be bullied or intimidated. It had become a symbol of what could happen when people stood together, fought for their homes, and never gave up. And Walter Hayes? He had found his place, not just as a farmer, not just as a soldier, but as a protector, a leader. The man who had once sought peace had become the man who would make sure Ironwood would never again be at the mercy of those who thought they could control it. Ironwood had a future, and Walter Hayes would be there to ensure it never fell into the wrong hands again. Ironwood's newfound peace had lasted longer than Walter had expected. The Hellfire Riders were no more, their criminal empire reduced to ashes, and the town was rebuilding, stronger and more united than ever. But Walter knew that peace, in a place like Ironwood, was fleeting. The world outside didn't operate on the same sense of justice, and people like the Riders would always be looking for a new place to expand their influence. It was late afternoon when Walter noticed the first signs that something wasn't right. A low rumble on the horizon, too far to be the sound of a thunderstorm, and too consistent to be anything but the sound of vehicles. Motorcycles, to be precise. He stood at the edge of his farm, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the distance. The clouds hung heavy in the sky, but something about the air felt off. Joe Briggs, ever watchful, appeared beside him, his gaze following Walter's. "Who is it?" Joe asked, his voice low but steady. Walter didn't answer immediately. He was trying to gauge the situation, listening for any other clues. It was a calm day, the kind of day when nothing was supposed to happen, but something was coming, and Walter could feel it. "Not sure yet, but we're about to find out." The rumbling grew louder, closer now. Walter's mind raced. Was it the remnants of the Riders? Or perhaps someone new, seeking to take control of the region? "They've got a lot of engines," Walter said, his voice tense. "And they're not here for sightseeing." Joe's jaw clenched. "What do you want to do?" Walter glanced at him. "We do what we always do. Get the people prepared. It's time to defend Ironwood." Within minutes, the small town was alive with activity. Walter quickly moved to the central square, where the town's emergency response network had been put in place after the Riders' attack. This wasn't the first time Ironwood had been on high alert, but Walter could feel the weight of the situation growing with each passing second. Joe had already begun organizing the men and women who were armed and ready to protect the town. Walter's crew, composed of former military, farmers, and everyday citizens, quickly gathered. Ironwood wasn't a military base, but it had a backbone of people who had been hardened by necessity. "What's the plan?" Joe asked, his hands resting on the rifle slung across his chest. Walter scanned the horizon again, his mind working quickly. "We set up perimeter defenses. Get the women and children into the underground shelters. The rest of us will stay on the streets. We're not sure who this is yet, but we'll prepare for the worst. If they want to fight, they'll get one hell of a surprise." Joe gave a brief nod and went off to direct the others, his authority unquestioned. Walter felt a knot tighten in his stomach as he watched the people of Ironwood moving into action. They had fought for this town once, and they would do it again. The bikers rolled into Ironwood around sunset. There were fewer than Walter had anticipated, maybe a dozen at most, but the sight of them was enough to send a ripple of unease through the town. They wore dark leather jackets with skull patches and insignia Walter didn't recognize. No one had seen them before. These weren't the Hellfire Riders. These were newcomers, an unknown threat. Walter watched them from the shadows of an old barn as they parked in the town square, revving their engines for an unsettlingly long time. They were testing the waters, seeing how the town would react. At first, they didn't do much. Just a group of bikers sitting on their motorcycles, eyeing the people around the square, taking in the scenery. But it was clear from the way they looked at the buildings, the people, the landscape. It wasn't curiosity. It was calculation. They were scoping out the place, deciding how best to take it. Walter's hands tightened around the rifle he'd carried since the days of his service. He wasn't about to let Ironwood fall again. Not without a fight. Joe moved in beside him, and Walter could see the same grim resolve on his face. The bikers hadn't made any aggressive moves yet, but Walter knew that could change in an instant. These men weren't here for a peaceful exchange. They had come for control. "They're testing us," Walter muttered. "They don't know what to expect." Joe's gaze was steady, his eyes sharp as he surveyed the bikers. "So, what now?" "Now," Walter said, his voice colder than before, "we send them a message. Ironwood doesn't belong to anyone but its people, and if they think they can take it, they'll have to go through me." As the bikers lingered, Walter moved through the town, making sure the defenses were in place. Ironwood was small, but it was prepared. Every person in town was armed or ready to defend their homes. The knowledge that they had already beaten the Hellfire Riders in the past made the people of Ironwood feel stronger. They weren't going to cower in fear. Walter met Joe again in the center of town, where the bikers had gathered. They were still sitting, chatting among themselves, but the tension was palpable. Walter couldn't afford to wait much longer. "We don't know who these people are," Joe said, his voice low. "But I've got a feeling we're about to find out the hard way." Walter nodded, a sense of calm settling over him. "Let's make sure they don't like what they find." With a sharp whistle, Walter signaled his team. They had been positioned around the town, waiting for Walter's orders. One by one, the people of Ironwood took their places, hiding behind buildings, ready to move. Walter had spent days ensuring they knew how to act quickly, how to handle a threat like this. It was time to show the bikers just how capable Ironwood had become. The lead biker, the one who seemed to be the leader of the group, stood up and started walking toward Walter. His leather jacket gleamed in the fading light, and his confidence radiated off him. He didn't seem concerned, didn't seem to realize that the town had already prepared for this confrontation. Walter stepped forward, his posture straight, his gaze unyielding. "You've made a mistake, friend. Ironwood doesn't belong to anyone but the people who live here." The biker laughed, shaking his head. "You think this little town is going to stop us? We've been everywhere, man. You don't scare us." "I'm not here to scare you," Walter said, his voice calm but full of menace. "I'm here to show you that Ironwood doesn't bend." With a single motion, Walter raised his rifle and fired a shot into the air. The sound was deafening, causing the bikers to flinch, but they didn't move. They had been through enough to know that intimidation wasn't something that came easily. But Walter wasn't finished. "Ironwood stands," Walter said, his voice carrying across the square. "And you're either part of that, or you're leaving." The silence that followed was thick. The bikers stood frozen for a moment, sizing up Walter. The air seemed to hang between them like a thread, waiting to snap. Walter's eyes stayed locked with the leaders. He wasn't going to back down. Ironwood wasn't going to back down. Slowly, the leader of the bikers raised his hand, signaling for his crew to hold their positions. He took a few steps forward, but it was clear he was weighing his options. "You think you can stop us, old man?" the biker spat. Walter didn't flinch. "I don't need to stop you. I just need you to know that Ironwood isn't for the taking." A tense moment passed, then the leader gave a sharp nod. Without a word, he turned back to his crew, signaling them to mount their bikes. "We're done here," the leader muttered. The bikers slowly revved their engines and began to leave, their exit not in defeat, but in reluctant retreat. Walter and Joe watched as they disappeared down the road, the hum of their motorcycles fading into the distance. Ironwood had sent its message, and for the first time in a long while, Walter felt that it was a message that would be heard loud and clear. The bikers' retreat was a victory, but Walter knew it was far from the end. They had been cautious, retreating when they realized that Ironwood wasn't the easy target they had expected. But Walter had seen that look in their eyes, the defiance, the frustration. They had underestimated Ironwood, but that wouldn't stop them from coming back. The next few days were filled with a tense quiet. The town was still buzzing with the news of the bikers' departure, but everyone knew that peace, as fragile as it was, might only last as long as the bikers' pride allowed. The real question now was, who had sent them? And how far did their reach extend? Walter spent his days organizing the defenses, ensuring that the people of Ironwood were ready for whatever might come next. He checked the perimeter himself, made sure the lookouts were in place, and took time to visit every family in town, making sure they knew what to do if trouble arrived again. But as the days wore on, Walter began to sense a deeper unease. The bikers weren't just out for territory, they were part of something much larger, something darker. One evening, as the sun began to set, Walter sat on the porch of his farm, looking out over the town. The wind had picked up, rustling the dry grass and stirring the dust on the road. Joe Briggs came up the path, his face tense, his boots kicking up dust as he approached. "Anything new?" Walter asked, not looking up from the horizon. Joe stopped in front of him, shaking his head. "Nothing from the bikers. But there's something you need to see." Walter stood up, curiosity piqued. "What is it?" Joe didn't speak, but instead, he handed Walter a folded piece of paper. It was a letter, written hastily, and the ink was smudged in places. Walter's brow furrowed as he read the words aloud. "Ironwood, you may have driven off the Hellfire Riders, but there are forces beyond your understanding. This town, and everyone who calls it home, will bow before us. We are coming. The Riders are only the beginning. Prepare for what's coming next. A friend." Walter's blood ran cold as he finished reading. The letter was a clear threat, a message that Ironwood wasn't finished with its fight. The Riders were only the foot soldiers. Whoever had written this letter had a far more sinister agenda. "Who sent this?" Walter asked, his voice low and dangerous. Joe shook his head. "No idea, but it's not the Riders. This is bigger than them, Walter. I think we've made someone else take notice." Walter crushed the letter in his fist, his jaw clenched. This was what he had feared all along. The Riders had been bad enough, but now they were just the tip of the iceberg. A shadowy force, lurking just out of sight, was watching Ironwood. "We need to prepare," Walter said, his mind already working through the possibilities. "And we need to find out who's behind this. These people won't just stop with threats. They'll come for us again." Joe nodded grimly. "We'll get the word out. We've got a few allies in nearby towns who might know something. We'll keep our eyes and ears open." The next few days were a blur of activity. Walter and Joe worked tirelessly, reaching out to their contacts in surrounding towns, looking for any trace of the mysterious group that had sent the letter. But as the days turned into weeks, it became clear that no one knew anything. There were whispers of a new criminal organization moving through the region, but no one had concrete information. They were a shadow, operating just out of reach. Ironwood's defenses were solid, but Walter couldn't shake the feeling that something darker was looming. The peaceful life he had built was slipping further and further away. The town had proven it could defend itself, but would it be enough when the true threat arrived? Late one night, after a long day of fortifying the town, Walter sat in his small farmhouse, staring at the map of the region spread across the table. His mind was running in overdrive, trying to make sense of the puzzle. Who were these people? Why had they chosen Ironwood? A sudden knock on the door broke his concentration. Walter's hand instinctively went to his rifle, but he forced himself to relax. It was too late for visitors. He stood up and approached the door, his steps silent on the wooden floor. When he opened it, he found Joe standing there, his face grave. "It's time," Joe said, his voice low. "We need to talk. You're not going to like what I've learned." Walter felt a cold knot in his stomach. "What is it?" "There's a bigger player in this region, someone with more reach than the Riders, and they're coming for us. We can't just sit here and wait." Walter's mind clicked. It wasn't just the Riders anymore. It was something more dangerous. Whoever was pulling the strings had seen Ironwood as a threat, and they weren't going to stop until it was destroyed. "What do we do?" Walter asked, his voice steady but filled with urgency. "We fight back," Joe said firmly. "We send a message. We show them that Ironwood won't be taken, no matter who they are." Walter gathered his closest allies and called a meeting at the town hall, the central point for their operations. The mood was tense, but the sense of purpose in the room was undeniable. The people of Ironwood were standing together, stronger than ever, ready to fight for their homes. "The Riders were just the start," Walter began, his voice steady but filled with authority. "We've made enemies, and now it's time to deal with them. They think they can take this town from us. They think they can intimidate us. But we've shown what happens when we stand together. Ironwood won't fall." He paused, looking around the room at the faces of those who had fought beside him. Joe, Marcus, the town's veterans, farmers, and even the younger folk who had never picked up a weapon in their life. Ironwood had become more than just a town. It had become a community. "We're going to make sure they know who they're dealing with," Walter continued. "But we need to stay smart. We hit them where it hurts, fast and hard. We send them a message they won't forget. If they want this town, they'll have to fight for it. And when they do, we'll be ready." The room erupted in nods of agreement, determination, and fire in their eyes. This was it. Ironwood had been tested before, and now it was time to show the world just how deep the town's strength ran. In the coming days, Walter and his crew set their plans in motion. They would hit the enemy's communication lines, disrupt their supply chains, and gather as much intel as possible on their leadership. This wasn't just about surviving. It was about taking the fight to the enemy and making them regret ever thinking they could take Ironwood. Ironwood would no longer be a small town on the map. It would be a symbol of resilience, unity, and strength. And Walter Hayes would lead them to victory. As the days wore on, the tension in Ironwood grew heavier. Walter had sent word to their allies in the surrounding towns, gathering what resources they could to stand against the growing threat. What had started as a small problem, a group of bikers with ties to a larger criminal organization, was now snowballing into a full-scale war. They weren't just dealing with the Riders anymore. They were up against a syndicate with deeper roots in the region than Walter had initially realized. The plan, for now, was to take the initiative, to act fast, hit their supply lines, cripple their communication, and gather as much intel as possible. Walter had spent the past few days organizing his team, training the townsfolk in guerrilla tactics, and ensuring that every corner of Ironwood was defended. It wasn't much, but it was all they had. And if they wanted to survive, they had to fight with everything they had. Walter had become the leader Ironwood never knew it needed. The people trusted him, followed his lead, and looked to him for direction. But Walter knew that, as much as they had accomplished, they couldn't take on this fight alone. The forces they were up against were ruthless, and if they didn't get ahead of the curve, Ironwood would be swallowed up. Walter stood at the edge of town early one morning, watching as a cold fog rolled in from the hills. His rifle was slung over his shoulder, and he had a clear view of the surrounding roads and paths leading in and out of town. The skies were overcast, and the chill in the air gave everything an eerie sense of foreboding. It was the calm before the storm. Joe Briggs approached quietly, as he always did. "Everything's set, Walter. The teams are in position, and the perimeter's secure. We've got eyes on the roads. If they're coming, we'll know." Walter nodded, his gaze focused on the horizon. "I don't think they're going to come for us in the way we expect. They'll try to divide us, force us to fight on multiple fronts. We need to stay sharp. The moment we let our guard down, that's when they'll strike." Joe clenched his jaw but didn't argue. "We've held our own before. We can do it again." "We'll do more than hold our own," Walter said, his voice low and filled with determination. "We're going to make sure they know they've made a mistake by coming here. Ironwood doesn't just survive, we thrive. And if they want it, they'll have to take it from my cold, dead hands." Joe didn't respond, but Walter saw the faintest smile flicker on his face. The sheriff had fought alongside him for years, and he knew Walter was more than capable of leading them into battle. But they had already seen what the Riders were capable of. This time, there would be no hesitation. The plan was set into motion by the end of the week. Walter's team moved like a well-oiled machine. executing the plan with precision. The supply depots were hit first. The riders had relied on stolen goods, food, ammunition, and equipment to fuel their operation, and Walter's team made sure they couldn't access any more of it. One by one, the supply caches were destroyed, and the riders were left with nothing to fall back on. While the riders scrambled to salvage what little they had left, Walter's forces worked quickly to gather intelligence. Their efforts paid off when they intercepted a transmission, one that revealed something far worse than they had anticipated. The syndicate they were up against wasn't just some small-time group of criminals. They were connected to an organization that stretched across the entire region, with ties to some of the most powerful people in the area. Law enforcement, politicians, and even military contractors were involved. The syndicate's reach extended far beyond Ironwood. Walter was standing in the makeshift war room in the town hall when the information came in. Marcus Bishop, who had been working on the intelligence front, laid out the map on the table. He pointed to a small cluster of locations near the edge of the region: warehouses, abandoned factories, and other spots marked in red. "We've got something big here," Marcus said, his voice grim. "This isn't just the riders. They've got connections everywhere. We've been hitting their supply chains, but they're still operating at full capacity. If we want to end this, we have to go after the heart of the operation." Walter's pulse quickened as he took in the details. "We're not dealing with a simple gang anymore. These people are organized, and they've got money and resources to keep coming back. I've got a lead on their leadership," Marcus continued. "If we take them down, we might be able to break the whole thing apart." Walter nodded, already formulating a plan. "Then that's what we'll do. We go after the leadership, take out the core of their operation, and force the rest of them into the open." The night before the raid, Walter gathered his team once more, preparing them for the next phase of the fight. The stakes had never been higher. This wasn't just about defending Ironwood anymore. It was about taking down a criminal empire, one that had infiltrated the region from the inside out. "We go in, we hit hard, and we leave nothing behind," Walter said, his voice resolute. "We make sure they know that Ironwood doesn't just fight back. We end things on our terms." Joe Briggs stepped forward, his face hardened with determination. "We've taken down the riders before. We can do it again. But we do this together. No one's alone in this." Walter looked around at the faces before him, the men and women who had become his family over the past months. They weren't soldiers, but they had the strength of conviction and the courage of those who had nothing left to lose. "You all know the stakes," Walter said, his voice filled with quiet power. "If we do this right, we put an end to this madness. Ironwood stands, and they'll know better than to mess with us." The next morning, before the sun had fully risen, Walter and his team set out, moving in silence as they approached the enemy's stronghold. The wind had picked up again, the air thick with tension. Walter's heart was steady, his mind focused. They were ready. They infiltrated the warehouse under the cover of the early morning fog, using the terrain to their advantage. Walter's crew worked seamlessly, taking out guards and neutralizing threats before they had a chance to sound the alarm. Every step was calculated, every movement deliberate. The riders had underestimated them before. They wouldn't make that mistake again. Inside the warehouse, they found their prize, the leadership of the syndicate. They were holed up, guarded and unaware of the storm that was about to hit them. Walter signaled his team, and the raid began. It was quick, brutal, and efficient. The syndicate's leaders were captured, their operations disabled, and their power structure shattered. Walter stood in the center of the warehouse, breathing heavily but standing tall. They had won again. But this victory felt different. This time, they had dealt the syndicate a blow they couldn't easily recover from. As Walter walked back to Ironwood with his team, the weight of the fight started to sink in. The town had faced a threat larger than anything they had ever imagined. But Ironwood had survived, and it would continue to survive. For the first time in months, Walter allowed himself to feel the weight of their success. They had fought for Ironwood, and they had won. Ironwood was still, the morning sun casting a warm light over the town as Walter and his crew made their way back. The dust from their journey settled on the dirt roads, and the town lay silent, almost as if holding its breath. The storm that had loomed over them for so long had finally passed. The syndicate's leadership was shattered, their operations crippled, and the riders, what remained of them, were scattered and leaderless. For the first time in what seemed like forever, Ironwood felt safe. But Walter knew that peace, true peace, was never as permanent as they wished. As he entered the town square, he was greeted by the familiar faces of the townsfolk, all of whom had been anxiously waiting for news. They had fought for their home, had stood together, and now, with the threat at their doorstep eradicated, they could finally start to rebuild, to think about the future without fear of what might come next. Joe Briggs approached him, wiping his brow with a rag, a satisfied but weary expression on his face. "Well, we did it, Walter," Joe said, his voice full of quiet pride. "The riders are done, and the syndicate's broken. It's over." Walter nodded, but there was no smile on his face. He couldn't shake the nagging feeling that there was still more to come. The victory they'd secured was hard-earned, but Walter had learned long ago that the world didn't just hand out peace. The moment they thought they were safe, something new would always appear. Something darker, something more insidious. "It's over for now," Walter replied, his voice low. "But we both know that peace doesn't last. This isn't the end of the fight. It's just a pause." Joe studied him for a moment, before offering a half-smile. "You're always thinking ahead. I can't say I disagree, but let's just take this one step at a time. For now, Ironwood stands. And we've earned a breather." In the weeks that followed, Ironwood slowly returned to normal. The townspeople began to rebuild what had been damaged during the conflict. The market was bustling again, the shops reopening, and businesses flourishing as word of Ironwood's victory spread. It became clear that the syndicate's influence had been far-reaching, but now, with their leadership gone and their infrastructure compromised, Ironwood had gained an advantage. People came to the town, not just as traders, but as allies, seeing in Ironwood the strength it had shown. Walter had made sure the town wasn't complacent. There were still those out there who could use this period of calm to their advantage. He worked closely with Joe to ensure Ironwood's defenses remained strong. They gathered more intel on potential threats, continued to train the townspeople, and maintained strong relationships with their allies. If another threat arose, they would be ready. But Walter also took time to step back, just a little. He spent more hours on his farm, working the land that had given him so much peace and purpose. The rhythm of life on the farm was a welcome change from the constant tension of the past months. It allowed him to reconnect with himself, with the town, and with the hope that had begun to grow stronger each day. It was one afternoon when Walter was working near the barn that he heard the rumble of engines in the distance. His heart rate quickened before he even looked up. The sound of motorcycles was unmistakable. The question was, who were they this time? Walter wiped his brow, his grip tightening around the pitchfork in his hands. He turned toward the road, his eyes narrowing. As the bikes drew closer, he could see a group of riders, no more than 6 or 7. They were wearing the same leather jackets, the same colors, the same insignia. It wasn't the riders. This wasn't their crew. Instead, it was a new group. The insignia was unfamiliar, but it was clear from their posture, the way they rode, that they weren't here to trade. They were here to take. Joe appeared beside Walter, a frown on his face as he observed the riders approaching. "Looks like we've got company," Joe said, a note of tension in his voice. Walter didn't respond right away. He studied the riders as they drew closer, their engines roaring like a warning shot. They didn't slow down as they neared Ironwood. They were clearly heading straight for the town. Walter turned to Joe, his jaw tight. "We'll handle this the way we always do. We don't back down." Joe nodded, reaching for his rifle. "You're not in this alone, Walter." The two men made their way toward the town square, the riders slowly approaching. They were riding in formation, but their confidence didn't match the undercurrent of hostility that ran through their ranks. They were here to test Ironwood, to push back against the town's newfound strength. As they rolled into town, Walter stepped into the street, his posture as firm as it had ever been. He raised his hand, signaling the bikers to stop. The leader of the new group, a tall man with a scar running down his cheek, slowed his bike to a stop and gave Walter a once-over. His eyes were cold, but there was no fear in them. "You're the one in charge here?" the man called out, his voice rough and edged with challenge. Walter didn't hesitate. "I am. And you are?" The man smirked, pushing his helmet back to reveal a face that looked like it had been carved from stone. "I'm the one who's going to make you regret thinking Ironwood belongs to you." Walter's eyes narrowed. He knew what was coming. Another group trying to establish dominance. Another gang looking to carve out a piece of Ironwood's hard-won success. But Ironwood wasn't just going to lie down. Not now, not ever. "You can try," Walter said evenly, stepping forward. "But Ironwood doesn't belong to anyone but its people." The man on the bike laughed, a cold, mocking sound. "We'll see about that. You'll give us what we want, or we'll take it." Walter didn't flinch. He had seen this before. He had fought against worse odds. And now, Ironwood wasn't just a town. It was a force. It wasn't just about defending the land. It was about defending the spirit of the people who had built it. "You won't get anything from us," Walter said. "Ironwood stands on its own." As the man began to dismount his bike, the tension in the air thickened. Walter could see the rest of the bikers sizing up the town, their hands hovering near weapons. But Walter didn't blink. He stood tall, unwavering, and waited. The silence between Walter and the biker leader stretched on, heavy and palpable. Every fiber of Walter's being was focused on the man in front of him, the new threat that had rolled into town with the kind of arrogance that only those who underestimated their opponents could have. The man wasn't just looking for a fight. He was looking to take control, to prove that Ironwood was just another stop on their road to dominance. But Walter knew something the biker leader didn't. Ironwood wasn't a town that rolled over. It wasn't a town that gave in, and it certainly wasn't a town that would let its people be bullied by someone like him. The man dismounted from his bike, his movements deliberate and confident. He took a step toward Walter, his eyes narrowed with challenge. "We don't want any trouble," Walter said, his voice low but strong, filled with the weight of someone who had been through worse. "But if you're looking for a fight, you'll get one. Ironwood doesn't belong to anyone but its people. You're welcome to try and take it, but you won't leave with it." The biker's smirk faltered slightly, but it was quickly replaced with a sneer. "You don't understand, old man. This isn't your town anymore. The riders may be done, but there's always someone bigger, someone stronger. And we're coming for what's ours." Walter took a deep breath, the weight of everything they had fought for pressing down on him. This wasn't just about defending Ironwood anymore. It was about proving that Ironwood wasn't going to be anyone's stepping stone. It was about showing the world that a small town, when it stood united, could bring even the biggest threats to their knees. "You've got one chance to turn around and leave," Walter said, his tone unwavering. "Go back to wherever you came from, and take your crew with you." The biker leader laughed, the sound full of contempt. "You think you scare us? We've been all over this region. There's nothing you can do to stop us." Walter's voice remained steady, his words clear and sharp. "I'm not trying to scare you. I'm telling you the truth. Ironwood stands. And if you think you can come in here and take anything from us, you'll find out just how wrong you are." A tense silence fell over the square as the rest of the bikers dismounted, a few of them drawing knives, others just sizing up Walter's group. The town had gathered to watch, but there was no fear in their eyes. Not anymore. Ironwood had already fought and won. They had seen what they could do when they stood together. Walter's gaze shifted briefly to Joe Briggs, who stood nearby, rifle slung across his chest, eyes sharp, waiting for Walter's signal. Walter gave him a brief nod. This was about to escalate, and they needed to be ready. The biker leader eyed Walter for a moment, then looked around at the gathered townsfolk, a mixture of curiosity and condescension in his expression. "You think these people will fight for you? They look like they'd rather run home and hide." Walter's eyes never left the biker. "They've fought for this town. They've stood against bigger threats than you, and they won. We're not running. Not now, not ever." It was then that the tension broke. Without another word, the biker leader raised his hand, signaling his crew to make their move. One of them lunged toward a nearby vendor, knocking over crates of produce, while another started shouting threats. But they weren't the only ones with a plan. Walter and Joe acted instantly. Joe raised his rifle, firing a shot in the air that echoed through the square like a thunderclap. The sound was enough to stop the bikers in their tracks, their weapons half raised, unsure of what to do next. "This is your last chance," Walter shouted. his voice cutting through the chaos. "Leave now, and you don't have to face what's coming." But the biker leader wasn't done yet. He sneered and gave a quick nod to his crew, signaling them to attack. The gang moved swiftly, pulling out weapons and charging toward the townsfolk. But this time, Ironwood was ready. Walter's crew, who had been stationed throughout the town, sprang into action. Former soldiers, farmers, and everyone in between were fighting together, defending their homes. The bikers had no idea what they were walking into. The fight was quick, but brutal. Walter moved with the same precision and intensity that had carried him through countless battles before. His rifle was steady in his hands, and he took out threats one by one with practiced calm. He wasn't here for vengeance. He was here to protect the people of Ironwood. Joe was by his side, his eyes scanning for any movement, his rifle a constant presence in his hands. He was taking down bikers left and right, his aim true, every shot disabling the threats that were left standing. The rest of Ironwood's defenders fought with the same ferocity. It wasn't just about protecting their homes. It was about protecting their way of life, the community they had built, and it was working. Slowly but surely, the bikers were being pushed back, their advance faltering in the face of the town's unexpected resistance. Minutes later, the biker leader, panting and bloodied, found himself cornered by Walter in the town square. His men were scattered, either on the ground or retreating, and the look in his eyes was one of desperation. "You really think you can do this?" The leader spat, his voice filled with hatred. "You've won this round, but there are others. You can't protect this town forever." Walter took a step closer, his hand steady on his rifle. "We don't need to protect Ironwood forever. We just need to protect it now. And if you and your crew think you can walk in here and take it, you'll learn that you're wrong. Ironwood stands, and it will stand as long as there are people who are willing to fight for it." The biker leader sneered but didn't try to fight anymore. The fight had already been lost. Ironwood had proven it was more than a target. It was a community that stood united. Walter signaled Joe, who stepped forward with his rifle lowered. The townspeople had won once again. The bikers had learned the hard way that Ironwood would not bow to anyone, not even to those who thought they could take control with violence. By the time the sun set, the square was quiet again. The battle had ended, but Ironwood's victory wasn't just in the physical fight. It was in the resolve of its people, the strength that had carried them through. Ironwood was no longer just a town. It was a symbol, and that symbol would live on, no matter who came next. Walter stood in the middle of the town square, watching as the townsfolk began to clean up the mess. There was no celebration, no fanfare, just quiet pride in what they had accomplished. They had stood together, and they had fought for their homes. The message had been sent. Ironwood would not be taken. The following days were spent in a quiet reflection for Ironwood. The town had weathered another storm, its people stronger and more united than ever. The battle had been hard, but the message was clear. Ironwood wouldn't bend to anyone. The bikers who had come to challenge them were gone, but as always, Walter knew that peace was temporary. In a world like this, there was always another fight, another enemy waiting to take the place of the last. Walter sat alone in his farmhouse one evening, looking over the farm. His fields were calm now, the land still bathed in the orange light of the setting sun. It was a familiar scene, one that should have brought peace to his mind, but instead, it felt like a calm before another storm. Ironwood had fought hard, and they had won. But there was a cost to every victory. The town had lost people. Some were injured. Others had fought to their last breath to protect their homes. The scars from the battle wouldn't disappear overnight. The strength of Ironwood was no longer in question, but Walter knew that with each victory, they had drawn more attention. And not all of it would be friendly. As the days passed, the town began to rebuild, as it always did. But Walter remained vigilant. He'd seen too many towns that had flourished for a time, only to be torn down by new threats. He wasn't going to let that happen to Ironwood. One evening, Joe Briggs arrived at the farmhouse, looking weary but determined. Walter was sitting on the porch, a glass of water in hand, and his gaze fixed on the horizon. "You've been working yourself too hard, Walter," Joe said, his voice light but filled with concern. "You need to take a break. The town's in good shape. Let the people handle things for a while." Walter didn't immediately respond, but he could feel the weight of the last few days pressing on him. "I can't, Joe. Not while there's still a chance they'll come back. I won't let Ironwood fall just because we've won a few battles." Joe sat down beside him, his eyes scanning the quiet town. "You've done more than enough. The people of Ironwood are ready to defend this place. But you can't keep pushing yourself like this. It's not just about fighting. It's about living too." Walter's eyes narrowed as he looked at Joe, taking in his words. He was right. Walter had been so focused on the next fight, the next threat, that he had forgotten to pause and breathe, to appreciate the quiet moments that had made Ironwood home. But in his heart, Walter knew that there was more to the town's survival than just its physical defenses. Ironwood wasn't just built on bricks and walls. It was built on the resilience of its people. And if they were to survive, he had to let them do their part. "You're right," Walter finally said, his voice quiet. "I just can't shake the feeling that something else is coming. The world doesn't rest for anyone." Joe clapped him on the shoulder, offering a small smile. "No, it doesn't. But for tonight, Ironwood is safe. And you need to rest. We all do." Over the next few weeks, Walter took a step back, allowing the town to rebuild and heal. The people of Ironwood were resilient. They didn't need constant oversight. They had proven that in the face of adversity, they could come together and defend what was theirs. Walter spent his time walking the land, checking in on the town, making sure everything was in place. There was a renewed sense of peace, but that peace was built on the foundation of hard work, sacrifice, and the willingness to fight for what mattered. One afternoon, as he walked through the fields, he stopped at the old cemetery on the edge of town. It was a quiet place, the headstones weathered by time, but the names on them told the story of Ironwood. The people who had built it, who had fought for it, and those who had paid the ultimate price to keep it safe. Walter stood at the edge of the cemetery, his mind drifting to those who had fallen in the battle against the Riders and the Syndicate. They hadn't just died in a fight. They had died for something bigger than themselves. And it was that same spirit that would keep Ironwood standing, no matter what came next. It wasn't long before news reached Walter's ears that the town of Silver Ridge, a neighboring community, had been attacked by a new gang, one that had appeared on the radar recently. The news was grim. The gang had taken control of Silver Ridge, and the people there were in danger. Walter knew that Ironwood couldn't ignore this threat. Silver Ridge was too close, and if the gang succeeded in taking control there, they would surely turn their sights on Ironwood. The message had been sent loud and clear. Ironwood wasn't finished with its battles yet. Walter sat down with Joe and the others in the town hall. They couldn't wait for the enemy to come to them. They had to act, and they had to act fast. "We're not just sitting around anymore," Walter said, his voice steady. "Silver Ridge needs our help, and we need to make sure the gang knows that Ironwood stands with its allies. We take the fight to them before they get too comfortable." Joe nodded. "We've got the strength. Ironwood won't back down. We move fast," Walter said, his gaze unyielding. "We hit their supply lines, neutralize their leadership, and leave nothing for them to come back to. We won't let them gain ground." Ironwood's fighters began to organize. They weren't just a town anymore. They were a force. Walter's leadership had transformed them into something more than survivors. They were fighters, ready to defend their future. Within days, Walter, Joe, and a small group of the town's best fighters made their way to Silver Ridge. The journey was long, and the tension in the air was thick. But as they approached Silver Ridge, Walter couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. The fight for Ironwood's future was far from over. They arrived just outside Silver Ridge to find the town in a state of disarray. The gang, called the Black Vultures, had already established their presence, pushing the local law enforcement and townsfolk into hiding. It was a messy situation, but it was one Walter knew how to handle. "We move in fast," Walter said, his voice grim. "We hit them where it hurts. No hesitation." Joe gave him a firm nod, his rifle slung over his shoulder. "We'll take them down. We won't let Silver Ridge fall." With a final glance at his team, Walter led the charge into Silver Ridge, knowing that this battle, just like the ones before it, wasn't just about survival. It was about proving that no one would take what they had built, and no one would stand in the way of Ironwood's future. The air was thick with anticipation as Walter and his team approached the outskirts of Silver Ridge. The town was eerily quiet, a stark contrast to the chaos that had recently engulfed it. Walter's mind was sharp, his senses alert as they crept through the narrow streets. The Black Vultures had taken control, and Ironwood's people weren't about to let this gang set up shop next door. Walter had already decided that they weren't going to waste time trying to reason with these people. They weren't here to negotiate or compromise. They were here to fight for Silver Ridge and send a message to anyone who thought Ironwood was vulnerable. If they allowed this gang to establish a foothold, it would only be a matter of time before they would come knocking on Ironwood's door. "Ironwood doesn't back down," Walter said, his voice low as he motioned for his team to hold their positions. "We've seen what happens when you push us. Now it's time to show them that we stand by our allies." Joe Briggs, walking just behind him, nodded in agreement. "We're here to send a message. No one threatens Ironwood, not while we're around." The streets were empty, save for a few lingering figures hiding in the shadows. The Black Vultures, Walter knew, liked to operate in the dark. Quick strikes, intimidation, and coercion. They thrived on fear, using terror to gain control. But Walter and his team had one advantage. The people of Silver Ridge weren't alone anymore. Ironwood was with them, and together, they would take back what had been stolen. They moved swiftly, silently, staying out of sight as they approached the town center. The plan was simple: cut off the Vultures' leadership, disrupt their communication, and hit their supply lines, all while making sure they didn't alert the entire gang to their presence. Joe and Marcus had set up lookouts along the perimeter of Silver Ridge, making sure they could act quickly and without notice. Walter's heart beat steadily as he took his place at the front of the group, his rifle steady in his hands. He had done this 1,000 times, but every time, it felt just as urgent. There was no room for error. Silver Ridge depended on them. As they neared the town square, Walter held up a hand to signal for the team to stop. The first Vulture scout was just ahead, pacing slowly, his back turned. Walter's breath slowed as he raised his rifle, focusing on the target. One shot, clean and precise, and the man dropped without a sound. The rest of the team moved forward, no more than shadows in the dark. "Keep moving," Walter whispered, his voice tight. "We take them one by one." They moved through Silver Ridge like ghosts, their strikes silent and calculated. Each enemy that fell was another step toward victory. The Vultures had no idea what was coming for them. It wasn't long before the rest of the gang began to realize something was wrong. A few Vultures began to stir in the town square, looking around with confusion and suspicion. They'd heard the shots, but the attackers were nowhere to be seen. Walter's team had become like the wind, unseen, but deadly. Walter looked up at Joe, who had positioned himself with a sniper rifle atop a nearby building. He gave Walter a thumbs up, signaling that the next phase of the operation was ready. They had hit the supply depot, destroying what little ammunition and provisions the Black Vultures had been relying on. Now, it was time to neutralize their leadership. They moved quickly to the large, decrepit warehouse that served as the Vultures' headquarters. The structure was old, its walls cracked and weathered, but its interior was fortified with makeshift barriers. It was where the leaders of the gang were holed up, planning their next move. Walter's team approached from 3 sides, ensuring that no escape routes were left open. They set up a perimeter, with Joe keeping watch from his vantage point, ready to pick off any would-be escapees. The rest of the team made their move, surrounding the building, staying as quiet as possible. Walter's pulse quickened. The heart of the operation was within his reach. He motioned for Marcus and a few of the others to breach the front door. With a single swift movement, they kicked in the entrance and stormed inside. The Vultures' leaders, armed and surprised, barely had time to react. Walter's voice rang out above the chaos. "This is it. Drop your weapons. You're surrounded." The Vultures' leader, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a thick beard, snarled at them as he reached for his gun. "You think you can take us down, huh? You think you can just come into Silver Ridge and make us leave?" Walter's eyes locked with the man's, and his voice was cold. "We're not here to negotiate. You're done. This town is under new protection, Ironwood's protection." A tense moment passed before Walter's team moved in, disarming the leader and his men quickly. They had trained for this, knew what to expect, and now, the black vultures were out of options. By the time the dust settled, the town square was quiet. The vultures' leadership had been captured, their weapons destroyed, and their hold on Silver Ridge broken. Walter stood in the middle of the square, his team regrouping, and the people of Silver Ridge beginning to emerge from their hiding places. The townspeople slowly came forward, their faces a mixture of fear and gratitude. It wasn't just the victory they were feeling. It was the relief that the threat had been neutralized, and their town was no longer under siege. Walter wiped the sweat from his brow, his eyes scanning the people around him. "You're safe now," he said, his voice steady but filled with quiet pride. "Silver Ridge is free. Ironwood stands with you, and we'll make sure no one takes what's yours again." Joe walked up beside him, his face grim but filled with a sense of satisfaction. "Another victory for Ironwood, but we'll need to keep our eyes open. We don't know how far their influence stretches." Walter nodded. "I know, but for now, we've taken back Silver Ridge, and we've shown the world what happens when people stand together. Ironwood doesn't just survive, we fight, and we fight for each other." As the townsfolk of Silver Ridge began to celebrate, Walter felt the weight of everything they had been through. They had won, yes, but Ironwood's fight wasn't over. The world was bigger than just Ironwood and Silver Ridge, and there would always be those who thought they could take control. But as long as the people of Ironwood stood together, they would always be ready. And Walter Hayes would be there to lead them through every battle, every challenge, and every fight that lay ahead. With Silver Ridge freed from the grip of the Black Vultures, Ironwood's reputation grew even stronger. The victory didn't just send a message to the gang. It sent a message to anyone who thought they could come to Ironwood and take what it had worked so hard to build. Walter and his team had proven that Ironwood was no longer a place to be toyed with. The town was a force, a community that had learned to stand together and defend its future. But even in victory, Walter couldn't shake the feeling that something darker was still lurking on the horizon. The Black Vultures were just another cog in a much larger machine. The way they had operated, quick, ruthless, with connections to other parts of the region, told Walter that Ironwood's fight wasn't over. It was only beginning. Ironwood had earned a brief respite, a moment to recover, to rebuild what had been lost. And yet, Walter could not ignore the nagging feeling that this was the calm before the storm. There was always another fight to be fought, another enemy to face. And Walter, once again, was at the center of it. Weeks passed, and Ironwood began to settle into a rhythm of peace. The markets were bustling, the shops were open, and families walked through the streets with renewed purpose. The once feared streets now felt safe, and the people of Ironwood found themselves more and more confident in their ability to handle whatever came their way. Walter had taken a step back from the constant leadership duties for a while, giving space for the townsfolk to truly feel the fruits of their hard work. He focused on the farm, planting seeds for the future, both literal and metaphorical. But peace never sat easily with him. The world outside had a way of creeping in, reminding him that even the safest places weren't immune to danger. It was on a quiet afternoon that Walter received word from a trusted ally in a neighboring town, a message that struck him with the weight of something he had feared would come. Walter sat in the war room at the town hall, the same place where plans for the previous battles had been laid out. Joe Briggs, Marcus Bishop, and a few of the town's leaders were gathered around the table, all eyes on Walter. He hadn't spoken yet, just stared at the map of the region in front of him, the weight of the news hanging heavily in the air. "We've received intel," Walter said, his voice steady but grim. "There's a new player in town, one we weren't expecting." Joe leaned forward, his expression hardening. "Who?" Walter pushed the map forward. "A group calling themselves the Red Hand. They've been moving through the region, wiping out anyone who stands in their way. They're more organized than the Riders, more dangerous than the Black Vultures. They're well-funded, with connections in high places." Marcus crossed his arms, his eyes scanning the map. "You think they're coming for Ironwood?" "I don't think it," Walter said. "I know it. They've already taken several towns, small ones, scattered through the region, just like we were. And now they're looking for something bigger." Joe frowned. "Ironwood." "Exactly," Walter replied, his eyes narrowing. They won't be content until they have it all. They won't stop with Silver Ridge. They'll move in, destroy anyone who resists, and take what they want. There was a long silence as the weight of the situation settled in. The people of Ironwood had fought to survive, and they had fought hard. But Walter knew this was different. The Red Hand wasn't some gang looking for quick cash. They were a well-organized, powerful faction that had set its sights on Ironwood. And Walter wasn't going to let them take it. The next few days were filled with urgency. Walter met with Joe, Marcus, and the rest of the town's leadership to begin planning their next move. The Red Hand wasn't going to be easy to defeat. But Walter had learned that the people of Ironwood were more than capable of facing whatever challenges came their way. "We can't wait for them to come to us," Walter said, his voice firm as he addressed the group. "We've seen how they operate. They take towns quickly, using fear, intimidation, and brute force. We need to be ready to fight back, and we need to do it before they even think about stepping foot in Ironwood." Joe nodded, his expression hardening. "You're right. We've fought for this place before, and we'll do it again. But we need to hit them fast, hit them hard. No hesitation." Marcus, who had been poring over the intel, spoke up. "We've got a chance to get ahead of them. I've tracked their movements. They're planning to move through a valley north of Ironwood. If we intercept them there, we can make sure they never reach the town." Walter's eyes lit up with recognition. The valley was the perfect location to ambush the Red Hand. It was narrow, surrounded by high cliffs, an ideal place for an attack. "We hit them before they even get close," Walter said, his mind already working through the logistics. "We'll set up a perimeter, use the terrain to our advantage. We're not giving them a chance to regroup. Once they're in that valley, we close in. We take them out one by one." The group nodded in agreement. They had done this before, and they would do it again. The plan was set in motion within hours. Ironwood's best fighters, including Joe, Marcus, and the veterans who had proven themselves in previous battles, were all part of the strike force. Walter knew that the people of Ironwood had learned how to fight, how to protect their homes, and now they would use everything they had learned to protect their future. As the team moved toward the valley, Walter couldn't shake the weight of the upcoming fight. The Red Hand wasn't just another gang. It was a well-funded, organized force that had the resources to change the course of the region. But Walter had learned something in his years of fighting. The strength of Ironwood didn't lie in weapons or tactics alone. It was in the people. It was in the willingness to fight, to stand together, and to never back down. And that was exactly what they would do. Stand together. The valley came into view just as the sun began to set. Walter and his team took their positions, setting up the ambush with military precision. The air was still, the only sound the distant rumble of the Red Hand's vehicles as they approached. Every man and woman in Ironwood had a role to play. They were ready. Walter's grip on his rifle tightened as the first signs of movement appeared in the valley below. The Red Hand was close. The time had come. The valley stretched out before them like a trap waiting to spring. Ironwood's defenders were positioned on high ground, hidden by the jagged cliffs that flanked the narrow, winding path the Red Hand was taking. The wind was sharp, carrying the scent of pine and earth, and everything felt still. Too still. The tension hung in the air, thick with anticipation, like the calm before a storm. Walter crouched low behind a boulder, his fingers brushing the familiar stock of his rifle. The Red Hand was getting closer. Every nerve in his body was focused on the task ahead, but his mind was racing, calculating, analyzing every possible move. They couldn't afford mistakes this time, not when the future of Ironwood was on the line. From his position, Walter could see the first vehicles, the Red Hand's convoy, moving slowly through the valley. Their trucks were armored, painted in dark colors, with armed men riding along the edges. Their weapons were ready, their eyes scanning the landscape. They were used to operating in hostile territory, but they had no idea who they were up against. Joe Briggs, positioned on another ridge, signaled to Walter. The convoy was approaching the choke point, the narrowest part of the valley where the cliffs on either side would make it impossible for them to retreat. This was where Ironwood's people would strike, swift and precise. Walter's heart was pounding in his chest, but his breath was steady. He'd fought battles before, but something about this one felt different. The Red Hand wasn't just another gang. They were the kind of people who would take everything from Ironwood without hesitation. This wasn't just about defending the town. It was about sending a message. Ironwood was not to be messed with. Walter raised his hand, signaling his team. The ambush was set into motion. The first shots rang out, sharp and controlled, like the crack of thunder that precedes a storm. Ironwood's fighters unleashed their firepower, targeting the tires of the convoy's lead vehicle. The heavy trucks screeched to a halt, their tires shredded by precision shots, and a few men fell as the attackers returned fire, but they were already in Ironwood's sights. Walter moved with the others, staying low, using the terrain to his advantage. His rifle was steady as he took out the first red handguard. His shot was clean, precise, the man dropping without a sound. Joe and the others were on the move now, firing at the remaining red hand fighters who had scrambled from the trucks to find cover behind rocks and trees. The fight erupted in the valley with a sudden intensity. The red hand, though powerful and well-armed, hadn't expected to face organized resistance like this. They were used to taking over towns without much opposition, relying on their numbers and brute force. But they had underestimated Ironwood, and now they were paying for it. Walter signaled for his team to advance, using the cover of rocks and cliffs to push further into the valley. The red hand was being pushed back, their lines fraying as more and more of them were taken out by well-placed shots from Walter's team. The ambush was working. Ironwood's forces had the advantage, and the red hand was struggling to regain control. As the battle raged on, Walter spotted their leader. Clad in dark armor, a long scar running down his face, and a rifle strapped to his back, moving to the rear of the convoy, trying to get away. He was clearly trying to regroup, but Walter wasn't going to let him escape. He had to deal with the leadership if they were going to stop the red hand from coming back for Ironwood. With a quick glance at Joe, Walter sprinted down the ridge, taking cover behind a large boulder. His team followed, each one moving with practiced precision, covering their flanks as they moved toward the leader's position. The Red Hand's leader, realizing the tide of the battle was turning, tried to flee the scene, but Walter wasn't going to let that happen. He cut through the chaos of the fight, moving fast, his focus solely on the leader. The air around him crackled with the sound of gunfire, but he ignored it, trusting his team to hold their ground. He was close now, and as the leader turned, a look of panic flashing across his face, Walter didn't hesitate. In a split second, he aimed and fired. The bullet struck the leader square in the chest, and he crumpled to the ground with a thud, his weapon falling from his hands. The Red Hand's remaining fighters froze for a moment, taking in the sight of their leader lying dead in the dirt. The message was clear. Ironwood wasn't just defending its town. It was taking the fight to them, ending it once and for all. The rest of the battle unfolded quickly after that. With their leader gone, the remaining Red Hand fighters were left disoriented, unsure of what to do. Some tried to flee, others fought back in desperation. But the organized resistance from Ironwood's people overwhelmed them. The Red Hand's forces were cut down one by one as Walter's team closed in. Joe and Marcus continued to provide cover from higher ground, picking off any remaining fighters with lethal accuracy. The town's fighters, veterans, farmers, and others who had stepped up to protect their homes, moved through the battlefield with the precision of soldiers. They weren't going to let anyone take Ironwood. By the time the last of the Red Hand fighters were subdued or captured, the valley was quiet again. The battle had been hard, but it had been decisive. Ironwood had sent a message, not just to the Red Hand, but to anyone who thought they could threaten the town. They were no longer just survivors. They were fighters, and they would protect their own, no matter the cost. As the dust settled and the wounded were attended to, Walter stood in the center of the valley, surveying the aftermath. The fight had been brutal, but it was over. For now, Ironwood was safe. The Red Hand had been stopped. Joe approached, wiping sweat from his brow, and gave Walter a tired but satisfied look. "We did it, Walter. They won't be back." Walter nodded, though there was a somber expression on his face. "It's over for now, but we know how this works. There will always be someone else. We can't let our guard down." Joe clapped him on the back. "No, we can't. But for today, we've won. We've sent them a message. Ironwood isn't going anywhere." Walter let out a slow breath, feeling the weight of the fight lift from his shoulders just a little. The battle had been won, but the war was far from over, and Ironwood, with its people, would be ready for whatever came next. Ironwood had proven its strength once again, and for as long as there were people like Walter Hayes to protect it, it would stand, no matter what. The dust had barely settled in the valley before the news of Ironwood's victory began to spread. The Red Hand was no longer a threat in the region, and Silver Ridge was beginning to breathe again. But even as the town of Ironwood celebrated, Walter knew that this fight would have lasting consequences. Ironwood had sent a message, but that message would not go unheard. The forces that had pushed back against them were connected to a much larger web of power, and they would not simply disappear. As the town began to clean up, Walter felt the weight of the victory begin to settle on him. His hands were still tight from gripping his rifle, his muscles sore from the battle, but there was a strange sense of calm now, one that had eluded him since the first day he'd arrived in Ironwood. The people of Ironwood had proven that they could stand together, that they could face down anything that threatened their home. But Walter knew that peace was fleeting, especially when you made enemies with the kind of power the Red Hand represented. Joe Briggs found Walter later that evening as the sun was setting over the town. It had been a long day, too long for anyone to consider resting, but the town had earned its time. The battle was won, and they had sent a message to any would-be invaders. Ironwood was no longer the quiet town it had once been. It was something more now. Walter was standing at the edge of the town, watching the sun dip behind the horizon. The colors in the sky were beautiful, deep reds and purples mixing with the fading light, a final reminder of the peace Ironwood had worked so hard to protect. "Looks like we've earned a few days of quiet," Joe said, standing beside him. His voice was weary but proud. Walter didn't immediately respond. His mind was elsewhere, lost in thought as he surveyed the land before him. "I can feel it, Joe. The calm before the storm. This won't be the last fight we face." Joe looked over at him, his brow furrowed. "You're not wrong, but we've proven something here. We've shown that Ironwood isn't just a place to be walked over. It's a place to be reckoned with." Walter nodded slowly, but there was an edge to his voice when he spoke. "That's true. But power like the Red Hand doesn't go away easily. It's like the Riders. When one group falls, another rises. And the ones that come after them, they'll be looking for a fight." Joe stood in silence for a moment, as if weighing Walter's words. "So what do we do now?" "We prepare," Walter said, turning his eyes toward the town. "We make sure Ironwood is ready for anything. We've earned the right to live peacefully, but that peace is something we have to defend. We don't let our guard down, not for a second." Over the next few weeks, the people of Ironwood kept a watchful eye. The victory had emboldened them, but Walter's warnings had not gone unheeded. The town was stronger now, with better fortifications and a community more tightly knit than ever before. They trained harder, honed their skills, and kept a sharp lookout for any signs of trouble. The local markets flourished again, and families returned to the rhythm of their daily lives. The women and children who had once stayed in hiding during the worst of the battles were now walking freely through the town. There was a new sense of pride, and for the first time in a long while, Walter could feel a peace settle in the hearts of Ironwood's people. But Walter couldn't shake the nagging feeling in his gut. Something was coming. The quiet didn't last long, and just when he thought it might, a letter arrived that confirmed his suspicions. It was late one evening when the courier delivered the message to Walter's door. The paper was thick, the handwriting bold and unmistakable. As soon as Walter saw the seal on the envelope, his heart sank. "Ironwood, you have proven to be a thorn in our side, but this game is far from over. The Red Hand was a warning, not a defeat, and you will learn that your resistance is futile. The next wave will come, and it will be swift." The Silent Hand. Walter sat down at the kitchen table, staring at the letter. He had been right. The Red Hand had been just the beginning. The Silent Hand was the real threat, the true power behind the chaos. They were an organization unlike anything Ironwood had faced. Silent, efficient, and deadly. "Joe," Walter called, his voice filled with urgency. Joe appeared in the doorway, his face instantly registering the tension. "What is it?" Joe asked, stepping forward. Walter handed him the letter, and Joe's face darkened as he read. "We've been targeted by someone bigger than we realized," Walter said, his voice tight with anger. The Red Hand was just their opening move. The Silent Hand. They're a force unlike anything we've encountered before. Joe handed the letter back to Walter, his eyes filled with concern. "What do we do now?" Walter took a deep breath, standing up and walking to the window. The horizon was darkening, the sun dipping low behind the mountains. "We prepare for the worst. The Silent Hand won't hesitate to take what they want. And Ironwood will not fall. We'll fight until there's nothing left to take." Joe nodded, his expression hardening. "We've got a town to protect, and I'll be damned if we let them walk over us like they've done to others." Walter met his gaze, a fire in his eyes. "We fight together, and we send them a message they'll never forget." The news of the Silent Hand's threat spread quickly through Ironwood. It was a blow to the town's sense of security, but Walter was clear with his people. They would stand firm. They had fought for Ironwood once, and they would do it again. Ironwood was more than just a town. It was a symbol of resilience, of the people who had chosen to fight for their future. The following days were spent preparing, fortifying Ironwood's defenses, and gathering intelligence on the Silent Hand. Walter reached out to every ally he could, ensuring that Ironwood was not alone in this fight. He knew that this battle would be different. The Silent Hand was not just a gang. They were a calculated, organized force with deep roots. But Walter had learned long ago that there was strength in numbers, and Ironwood would not back down. As the days passed, the people of Ironwood braced themselves for what was coming. They had fought for their town before, but now they were fighting for their future. And Walter Hayes, the man who had led them through so many battles, would lead them again, into the next fight and the one after that. Ironwood wasn't just a town. It was a testament to the power of resilience and the unwavering spirit of its people. And no matter what the Silent Hand had planned, Walter would make sure Ironwood stood tall, always. Ironwood had grown accustomed to fighting back, to standing firm against threats that seemed impossible to overcome. The town had seen its fair share of battles, each one more intense than the last. But the threat posed by the Silent Hand was unlike anything they had ever faced. A shadowy, well-organized force, the Silent Hand wasn't simply a gang. They were a network of power brokers, mercenaries, and criminals who operated from the highest levels of society. And their grip had reached further into the region than Walter had ever imagined. Walter couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, a storm that would test everything Ironwood had built. The days following the arrival of the letter were filled with a nervous energy. People knew the fight wasn't over, but they didn't yet know how intense the battle would be. The people of Ironwood had come together before, and now it was time for them to do it again. Walter spent his days working with Joe Briggs and Marcus Bishop to prepare the town for the oncoming storm. They couldn't afford to wait for the Silent Hand to strike. They needed to act, to stay ahead of them. But Walter also knew that the best defense was one that struck first. The first step in the plan was to gather intelligence. Walter knew they needed to understand the Silent Hand's operations better before making any major moves. He had his contacts in neighboring towns, but it wasn't enough. The Silent Hand had grown too powerful, too insidious. Their reach extended beyond what Ironwood had faced before. One evening, Marcus Bishop arrived at Walter's farmhouse with news that gave Walter a glimpse of what they were truly up against. "There's something I didn't want to tell you earlier," Marcus said, his voice low, as he sat down across from Walter. "The Silent Hand? They have a network. And I mean a real network. Government officials, business magnates, military contractors. This isn't just some ragtag group of criminals looking for a fight. These people move in the shadows of power, and they're using that power to control everything in this region." Walter listened closely, his brow furrowed in concern. "How deep does it go?" "I've been digging into their operations," Marcus continued, his hands clenched on the table. "And it's worse than we thought. They've been operating in plain sight for years, under the radar, building a network of influence. They're not interested in just taking towns. They're interested in control. The kind of control that comes with money, resources, and strategic power." Walter let out a slow breath. He had suspected the Silent Hand wasn't just a gang, but hearing it from Marcus made the situation all the more real. "What's the next move?" "We can't just fight them head-on," Marcus said, shaking his head. "They're too entrenched. They'll crush us if we do. But we can't let them operate unchecked. The Silent Hand thrives on secrecy. We have to expose them, disrupt their plans, and cut off their sources of power." Walter's mind was already working, thinking of the best way to proceed. "We need to hit them where it hurts. Disrupt their network. Take down their financial backing. Make them afraid to operate in the open." Over the next few days, Walter set his plan into motion. Ironwood couldn't face the Silent Hand directly. Not yet. They didn't have the resources or the inside connections to challenge them head-to-head. But they had something far more valuable: their community. And Walter knew that if Ironwood could expose the Silent Hand's operations, disrupt their flow of power, they could level the playing field. The first target was the Silent Hand's financial base. Marcus had managed to gather intelligence on a local bank, one that the Silent Hand used as a front for laundering money and funding their operations. Walter's plan was simple: strike quickly, cut off their access to funds, and leave them scrambling. The night before the operation, Walter stood outside the bank with Joe and Marcus. The air was cold, and the wind had picked up, carrying the scent of smoke from the fires in the distance. The town was quiet, too quiet. But Walter knew they had to act before the Silent Hand even realized they were under attack. "We hit them fast," Walter said, his voice firm as he checked his equipment. "We can't afford any mistakes. Once we've disabled their financial operation, we'll move on to the next step." Joe gave him a hard look, his eyes filled with determination. "You're sure about this? This is a big risk." Walter met Joe's gaze, his own resolve steady. "We don't have a choice. If we don't cut off their money, they'll keep coming. And if we let them, they'll own everything in this region." Marcus stepped forward, his face grim. "We've got one shot at this. Once we make our move, there's no going back." The operation was set into motion at midnight. Walter's team moved swiftly, their actions synchronized. As they infiltrated the bank's heavily guarded compound, they used the cover of darkness to slip past security, neutralizing the few guards who stood in their way. The goal was simple: disable their money laundering operations, destroy the records, and make it impossible for them to recover quickly. Walter led the charge, using his knowledge of tactical operations to stay 2 steps ahead of the Silent Hand's security. Joe and Marcus covered their flanks, ensuring that no one was left behind. The mission was clean, precise. No one expected Ironwood to be capable of such an attack. Within an hour, the bank's operations had been dismantled. Financial records were shredded, vaults were emptied, and the Silent Hand's access to the town's resources was severed. Walter stood at the center of the operation, watching as his team finished up. The mission had been a success, but Walter knew that this was just one part of a much larger battle. "Let's go," he said, his voice low. "We've made our point, but they'll come for us now." As Walter and his team moved out, the sound of sirens began to wail in the distance. The Silent Hand had realized they'd been hit, but it was too late. Ironwood had taken the first step. The following weeks were tense as the town prepared for the inevitable retaliation. Walter knew the Silent Hand wouldn't take the loss of their financial base lightly. They would come for Ironwood. But Ironwood had already proven that they were ready. The town's defenses were stronger, its resolve unshakable. Walter spent his days rallying the people of Ironwood, making sure they were ready for whatever came next. The people who had stood together in the past would stand together again. And this time, they weren't just fighting for survival. They were fighting for their future. The battle for Ironwood was far from over. The Silent Hand had been struck, but they would strike back. And Walter Hayes would be there, leading the fight, ensuring that Ironwood stood tall, no matter the cost. Ironwood had sent a strong message. They had hit the Silent Hand where it hurt, at the very heart of their operations. But in doing so, they had awakened a force far more insidious than they had anticipated. The Silent Hand wasn't just an enemy that could be fought with bullets and tactics. They were a network, a shadowy organization whose reach extended far beyond the borders of Ironwood. And with their financial base crippled, they would strike back. Hard. Walter had always known the battle for Ironwood's survival was more than just a fight against bikers or small-time criminals. It was a war for the soul of the town itself. And now, the Silent Hand had declared war. They would come for Ironwood, not just with guns, but with their wealth, their influence, and their ability to manipulate the systems that made towns like Ironwood vulnerable. This would be the most dangerous fight yet. Days after the raid on the bank, Walter began to feel the pressure mounting. There were rumors, whispers in neighboring towns about unusual activity, government officials moving in and out of towns at night, businessmen who had once stayed in the shadows now appearing in the open. It wasn't just about Ironwood anymore. The entire region was under threat. One evening, as Walter sat in his farmhouse, the weight of it all pressing on his shoulders, Joe Briggs appeared at the door, his face grim. He wasn't here for a casual visit, Walter could tell. "Got something you need to see," Joe said, stepping inside. His voice was low, but the urgency was evident. Walter stood up, his heart picking up speed. "What is it?" Joe handed him a small envelope. No seal, no return address, just a plain piece of paper with bold, scrawled handwriting. "Ironwood's defiance will cost you. We control more than you realize. This is just the beginning. Prepare to lose everything." The silent hand. Walter read it twice, the words sinking deep into his gut. He had known that the silent hand wouldn't be content with their financial loss. But this was a declaration. They weren't just threatening Ironwood. They were warning Walter that this battle was no longer just about towns and territories. It was about control, about eliminating a symbol that dared defy them. Joe's eyes were hard, his jaw clenched. "We knew they wouldn't back down. But this is something else. This isn't just about Ironwood anymore. It's about what we stand for." Walter nodded, folding the letter slowly. The implications of it were massive. The silent hand wasn't just interested in taking Ironwood. It wanted to make an example of it. If Ironwood could survive, others would follow. And if that happened, the silent hand's grip on the region would begin to loosen. This was bigger than Walter had ever imagined. "We need to move fast," Walter said, his voice tight with resolve. "We've already hit them hard, but they won't stop. This is war now. We have to prepare for everything. We can't let them break us." Over the next few days, Walter met with Marcus, Joe, and the other leaders in the town. They needed to figure out their next move, and they needed to do it fast. The silent hand's influence was growing, and Ironwood couldn't afford to just sit and wait for the next strike. The town had to take the fight to them before they could move on Ironwood again. Marcus was the first to speak, his face weary but determined. "We've got a problem. We've disrupted their financial operations, but they're moving quickly. They've already set up shop in a few neighboring towns. They've got their hooks in deep." Joe spoke next, his voice rough. "If they've got their hands in the pockets of local governments, we're in for a long fight. They control everything: business, law, resources. It's not going to be enough to fight them with just guns. We need to start targeting their sources of power: politicians, businessmen, people who protect them." Walter ran his hand through his hair, pacing. "You're right. It's not just about guns and ammo anymore. It's about dismantling their network. We take away their power, and they lose their ability to move freely. We need to find their connections, hit them where they're strongest." Marcus turned to Walter, his eyes sharp. "And we need to make them fear us. They've already underestimated Ironwood. If we show them we can't be broken, that we'll fight back no matter what, they'll have to think twice before coming at us again." Walter met Marcus's gaze, the weight of leadership heavy on his shoulders. "We won't just fight for Ironwood. We'll fight for every town in this region. We're making a stand, not just for ourselves, but for everyone who's afraid to stand up. If we let them take Ironwood, they'll start coming for the rest of the region. We can't let that happen." Over the following days, Walter put his plan into action. It wasn't enough to just fight the silent hand on the front lines anymore. They needed to target their infrastructure, disrupt the power they had in local politics, expose their corruption, and destroy the foundation they had so carefully built over the years. Walter had Marcus dig deeper, searching for the people who had been working behind the scenes: businessmen who had ties to the silent hand, corrupt officials who had allowed them to operate unchecked. He needed to find out who was funding them, who was covering for them. And once they had the names, they would act quickly. The town of Ironwood didn't just need to survive. It needed to strike back, and strike back hard. One morning, as Walter was going over the plans with Joe and Marcus, news came through that would change everything. A town near Ironwood, a place called Hillcrest, had been overrun. The silent hand had moved in quickly, seizing control of the local government and businesses. The people of Hillcrest were being forced to comply or face the consequences. Walter's heart sank. Hillcrest wasn't far from Ironwood. The Silent Hand was moving closer, their influence spreading like a disease. "We can't wait anymore," Walter said, his voice filled with urgency. "We need to make a move, and we need to do it now. Ironwood can't stand alone in this fight. We need to rally the other towns. If the Silent Hand takes Hillcrest, it won't be long before they're at our doorstep." Joe clenched his fists. "We're not letting them take Ironwood. We stand together. No one's getting through us." Walter nodded, his mind already racing with the next steps. "We're not just protecting Ironwood. We're protecting every town in this region. This is where it ends. The Silent Hand won't be able to take another town without a fight." The next few days were a blur of activity as Ironwood prepared for what was to come. Walter's message was clear. Ironwood wasn't just a town. It was a movement, and if the Silent Hand wanted to bring it down, they would have to do it over his dead body. The townspeople gathered together, ready to stand united. The fight wasn't over. It had just begun. The morning air in Ironwood felt charged, thick with anticipation. The Silent Hand was coming for Ironwood, but Walter knew they weren't coming alone. Their grip on the region had tightened in recent weeks, and now it was clear. Ironwood wasn't the only town under threat. The Silent Hand had already taken Hillcrest, and Walter knew they wouldn't stop there. They had set their sights on something bigger, something that Ironwood would never allow to fall. Walter and Joe stood at the edge of town, looking out over the open plains that stretched for miles. The day had arrived. Word had been sent to neighboring towns, Silver Ridge, Blackstone, and a few others. They were going to fight together. This wasn't just Ironwood's battle anymore. This was a fight for the entire region, and Walter was going to lead it. "We've done this before, but this time it's different," Walter said, his voice steady, though the weight of the coming fight was pressing down on him. "The Silent Hand is bigger, stronger, and more organized than anything we've faced. But we've got something they don't. Unity." Joe looked over at him, his face hard but filled with determination. "We've got a hell of a lot more than just unity. We've got a fight, and we're ready to finish it." Walter nodded, grateful for Joe's unwavering support. "We're not just defending Ironwood. We're defending everyone who's been silenced by people like the Silent Hand. This ends now." The response from the neighboring towns had been overwhelming. For the first time, the surrounding communities had seen what Ironwood was capable of. Walter had taken a risk when he sent out word that they were going to resist the Silent Hand. But the people weren't afraid. They had seen the destruction, the manipulation, the way the Silent Hand moved through the region like a cancer, and they weren't going to stand by and let it spread any further. By the time the sun set on the first day of their alliance, Ironwood and the neighboring towns had solidified their positions. The people had armed themselves, fortified their homes, and prepared for what was coming. There was no turning back now. They couldn't afford to. That night, Walter sat alone in the war room, his thoughts running wild. His mind raced over the plans they had laid out, over the names of the Silent Hand's key figures they had uncovered, over the towns that had already fallen. But there was one thing Walter couldn't shake, something deep down that gnawed at him. They had a plan, yes. They were ready to strike. But was it enough? The Silent Hand was vast. Their power extended beyond the borders of Ironwood, beyond the reach of the small towns they had already targeted. They were a well-oiled machine, and Ironwood was a speck in their eyes. The fight was bigger than they had anticipated. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. He stood and opened it, only to find Marcus standing there, his face grim. "It's happening sooner than we thought," Marcus said, handing him a folder. "I've got intel. They're moving through Blackstone. We've got about 2 days before they hit our borders. They're using Hillcrest as a launch point. They're coming at us from all sides." Walter took the folder and looked over the details. The Silent Hand was closer than ever. They were going to come at Ironwood with everything they had, hoping to crush them before they could even get organized. Walter's heart raced as he scanned the plans. He knew they had to act fast. By morning, the alliance had met, and Walter's plan was put into motion. There would be no waiting. The Silent Hand was too close to Ironwood now to risk a drawn-out conflict. They had to strike first. and they had to do it with precision. "We take the fight to them," Walter said to the gathered leaders of the neighboring towns. "They're planning to hit Ironwood in 2 days. We don't have that kind of time. We move now." Joe stepped forward, his face a mixture of determination and concern. "We've been preparing for this moment, but it won't be easy. We know the Silent Hands operations, but they'll have reinforcements. We can't just rely on numbers." "We don't need to," Walter replied, his gaze firm. "We've got the advantage of surprise. We'll hit them before they even know what's coming." The leaders of the neighboring towns nodded, their faces hard with resolve. This wasn't just about Ironwood anymore. It was about the entire region. They were in this together. The plan was simple, but bold. Walter's team would strike the Silent Hands supply lines, cutting off their ability to communicate and mobilize. Meanwhile, the towns would prepare to defend their borders, setting up traps and strategic positions to halt the Silent Hands' advance. It would be a series of quick, precise attacks aimed at destabilizing the enemy and forcing them to retreat. The first target, a supply convoy moving through the outskirts of Blackstone. It was one of the Silent Hands' main channels of resupply, and Walter knew it was a vital link. Without it, the Silent Hand would be crippled. The second target, a communications hub that had been set up near Blackstone, which the Silent Hand used to coordinate their attacks. Taking that out would blind them. The night before the operation, Walter stood with Joe and Marcus near the town square, watching as the final preparations were made. The town was alive with activity. People were organizing, fortifying their homes, and preparing for the inevitable fight. There was no fear in their eyes, only resolve. "We've got one shot at this," Marcus said, his eyes scanning the horizon. "If we hit them hard enough, we can make them rethink coming after Ironwood. But we need to be fast." Walter looked at Joe. "We've done it before. We'll do it again. Ironwood stands." Joe gave him a quick, determined nod. "No one's walking away with what's ours." The following morning, Walter's team moved out, along with the forces from Blackstone and Silver Ridge. The mission was simple but dangerous. Hit the supply lines, disrupt their communication, and leave no trace behind. They were going in fast, silent, and deadly. By the time the sun had reached its peak, Walter and his team were already in position. They took out the supply convoy with swift precision, striking when the Silent Hand least expected it. The convoy's guards never had a chance, and by the time reinforcements arrived, it was too late. The trucks were destroyed, the supplies gone, and the Silent Hand's logistical capabilities were thrown into chaos. The next target was the communications hub. The team moved in quickly, cutting the lines and disabling the equipment. The Silent Hand's ability to communicate with their forces was now severely limited. As Walter stood in the midst of the destruction, his heart was still steady, but his mind raced. The Silent Hand had been dealt a blow, but how long before they regrouped and retaliated? He had sent a message. Ironwood was not to be underestimated, but the battle was far from over. Walter wasn't naive enough to think the Silent Hand would simply walk away. Ironwood's message had been sent. The Silent Hand had felt the sting of defeat, their supplies and communication crippled. Walter could feel the momentum shifting in their favor, but as always, a deep part of him remained alert. He knew this was not the end. The Silent Hand, for all their stealth, could not afford to let this act of defiance go unanswered. And Walter wasn't foolish enough to think that Ironwood would remain untouched. The victory had been swift, clean, and precise. But the calm after the operation was short-lived. Walter stood at the head of the town square, overlooking the town as the people of Ironwood began to breathe again. The fight had been hard, but for now, they had won. Walter turned to Joe, who had just returned from scouting the perimeters. Joe's face was tight, his eyes alert. "Something's off, Walter," he said, his voice low but serious. "We've hit them hard, but I'm telling you, their response is coming. It's only a matter of time before they regroup." Walter nodded, his mind racing. "I know. I've been expecting it. They're not going to just sit back and let this slide. The Silent Hand doesn't take defeat lightly." Joe met his gaze. "We've thrown a wrench in their plans, but they've got more resources than we've seen. They won't just come at us with guns. They'll use everything they've got." "I'm ready for that," Walter said, his voice unwavering. And Ironwood is ready too. We fought for this town before, and we'll fight for it again. But I'm not waiting around for them to make the first move. Over the next few days, Walter began preparing Ironwood for the inevitable retaliation. He met with the town's leaders, discussing the next phase of their defense. They couldn't afford to sit back. The Silent Hand had proven they were not just about brute force. They were strategic, and they had an uncanny ability to exploit weaknesses. Walter's first priority was to fortify the town further. The main road into Ironwood was narrow, making it the perfect spot for a potential ambush. If the Silent Hand wanted to take the town, they would have to go through that choke point. Walter ordered his team to build traps, barricades, and hidden positions along the path. It wasn't just about being ready for an attack. It was about making Ironwood an unappealing target. But Walter also knew they needed to hit the Silent Hand where it hurt the most. Their power, the network that sustained them, the men and women in the shadows who kept everything running smoothly. They had to disrupt that network even further. "We need to move quickly," Walter said to Marcus and Joe as they huddled in the town hall, looking over the intel they had gathered. "We can't give them time to recover. If we wait too long, we'll be fighting on their terms." Joe slammed his fist on the table. "Then we take the fight to them again. They've got no idea what we're capable of." Marcus leaned forward, his eyes narrowed. "It won't be easy. The Silent Hand is methodical. They'll want to hit back hard, and they'll come for Ironwood. But we can't wait for them to make the first move." Walter turned to them, his expression unyielding. "We don't wait. We strike fast. We take out their operatives, sabotage their movements, and force them into retreat. We're not just defending Ironwood. We're dismantling their infrastructure." The next operation was set into motion with urgency. Walter's team would infiltrate the Silent Hand's remaining strongholds, focusing on key figures who kept the organization running smoothly. They needed to make it clear that Ironwood wasn't just a town. It was a force, and anyone who stood in its way would fall. Joe and Marcus led the charge, moving through the shadows like ghosts. The first target, a corrupt businessman in a neighboring town, one with deep ties to the Silent Hand. If they could cut off his access to resources, they would cripple the Silent Hand's ability to operate in the region. The second target was a government official who had been working closely with the Silent Hand, funneling information and protection in exchange for power. Taking him out would send a message that Ironwood wouldn't tolerate corruption. Walter watched as his team disappeared into the night, each of them carrying the weight of their mission. He didn't worry about their success. He trusted his people. What worried him was the inevitable backlash. The Silent Hand wouldn't just let this go. By the time they returned, Ironwood had dealt another blow to the Silent Hand. The corrupt businessman was exposed, his assets seized, and his ties to the Silent Hand severed. The government official had been quietly removed from power, leaving a significant gap in the Silent Hand's influence. It wasn't much, but it was enough to destabilize them further. But as Walter looked over the results of the operation, he felt no sense of victory. The damage had been done, yes, but the Silent Hand was far from defeated. They were silent, calculating, and far more dangerous than any gang Ironwood had ever faced. They didn't just rely on brute force. They were smart, strategic, and had connections in every corner of the region. The people of Ironwood gathered in the square that night, and Walter addressed them for the first time since the latest operation. The mood was a mix of tension and determination. They had fought before, and they would do it again. But they had no illusions about the road ahead. "We've taken another step in making sure Ironwood remains free," Walter said, his voice steady. "But this fight is far from over. The Silent Hand has resources, connections, and power. But we have something they don't: each other." The crowd fell silent, their eyes fixed on Walter. They were used to his resolve, used to the way he led them through every challenge. But tonight, the stakes were higher than ever before. "We won't back down," Walter continued. "Ironwood is a symbol of resistance, a place where people fight for what's right. And as long as we stand together, they will never take us." The crowd erupted in applause, the sound of their unified resolve echoing through the square. Ironwood was no longer just a town. It was a beacon, a place that fought not just for survival, but for the future. The next few days passed in a flurry of activity. Walter continued to rally the people of Ironwood, preparing them for the inevitable retaliation. They couldn't afford to be complacent. The Silent Hand was regrouping, and they wouldn't stop until Ironwood had been crushed. But Walter wasn't afraid. He had seen worse. He had led men into battle where the odds were stacked against them, and they had emerged victorious. Ironwood wasn't just a town. It was a force, a family of people who would never back down. Ironwood would stand, no matter what came next. The calm before the storm had stretched on longer than Walter expected, but the warning signs were unmistakable. The Silent Hand was regrouping, moving in the shadows, and the tension in the air around Ironwood was palpable. Ironwood had delivered blow after blow to the Silent Hand, but Walter knew they wouldn't take the hits quietly. They had underestimated Ironwood before, and now it was time for the Silent Hand to make their final move. Walter sat alone in his office late one night, the town quiet outside. His thoughts weighed heavy, each decision, each action taken, now feeling like a single piece of an impossible puzzle. The Silent Hand's grip on the region was still powerful. Despite all the strikes Ironwood had made against them, the enemy was persistent, and their reach was vast. There was only one way this could end. Ironwood had to break the Silent Hand's back once and for all. He heard a faint knock on the door and turned to see Joe Briggs step inside, a grim look on his face. "We've got company," Joe said, his tone low but urgent. Walter stood, his chest tightening. "They've come for us." Joe nodded. "They're at the gates, Walter. A full force. They're coming in, guns blazing. This is it. The final stand." Walter's heart hammered in his chest, but his voice remained steady. "We've prepared for this. Ironwood will stand." Ironwood had become more than just a town. It had become a symbol of resistance, of unity against overwhelming odds. But as Walter and Joe gathered the townspeople and moved into position, he knew that this battle would be different. The Silent Hand had learned from their previous mistakes. They weren't going to make the same errors they had before. This would be their final push to crush Ironwood. The barricades were set up, and every citizen had their role to play. This time, there would be no underestimating the enemy. Ironwood had become a fortress, and Walter had every intention of making sure it stayed that way. They could hear the sounds of trucks and vehicles approaching the town from the distance. Ironwood wasn't a large town, but its strategic position and fortified defenses had always made it a hard target. The Silent Hand wasn't just coming for a fight. They were coming to wipe Ironwood off the map. Walter moved through the streets with Joe, leading their forces to the front lines. Every corner of Ironwood had been prepared. Every alleyway, every building, every defense reinforced. They wouldn't let the Silent Hand just walk in. "Hold your ground," Walter shouted to the gathered fighters. "We stand together. No matter what, we hold Ironwood." The first wave came fast, the rumble of engines vibrating through the earth. Walter's heart pounded as he took his position behind a barricade, rifle in hand, watching as the enemy vehicles closed in. The air felt thick with the promise of violence, but Walter was calm, focused. Ironwood would not fall without a fight. The first vehicle to approach was a heavily armored truck, bearing the insignia of the Silent Hand. Walter's eyes narrowed as it neared the choke point, the narrow street where the Silent Hand would be forced to slow down. He signaled to Joe, who was positioned with the sniper team, and nodded once. The trap was set. Joe's rifle cracked, the sound of it carrying through the tense air. The lead vehicle's tires exploded, sending it careening off course. The road ahead was suddenly blocked by debris, and the Silent Hand's forces were thrown into chaos. Ironwood's fighters emerged from the shadows, opening fire, the first wave of resistance slowing the enemy's advance. "Now!" Walter barked, moving forward with his crew. The attack had begun in full force. The Silent Hand's forces scattered, returning fire, but Ironwood had the advantage of the terrain, the barricades, and the element of surprise. The battle was fierce, but Ironwood had prepared for this moment. The Silent Hand's men fought with desperation, but they were unprepared for Ironwood's tenacity. Walter's heart raced as he moved through the fray, his rifle steady in his hands. The sounds of gunfire were deafening, but his focus was sharp. He moved like a man with a singular purpose, to protect his town, to protect his people. There was no time to think beyond this moment. The battle raged on through the night. The Silent Hand pushed forward, but Ironwood held its ground, every fighter in the town pulling their weight. There were losses. There would always be losses in war. But Ironwood had something the Silent Hand could not overcome: unity. Ironwood fought for each other, for the community they had built, for the future they had promised themselves. By the time the first light of dawn broke through the dust-filled air, the Silent Hand's forces had been broken. The barricades were littered with debris, and the bodies of both Ironwood's defenders and the Silent Hand's soldiers lay strewn across the battlefield. But Ironwood had won. The Silent Hand's advance had been stopped. Walter stood in the town square, his eyes scanning the aftermath of the battle. The people of Ironwood had held strong. There were no words to describe the pride he felt in their courage, in their resolve. They had stood together, faced an enemy that outnumbered them, and they had won. Joe approached, his face drawn but filled with relief. "We did it, Walter. They're done. We've broken their back." Walter nodded, his voice low. "For now, the Silent Hand will regroup, but we've sent them a message. They know they can't control Ironwood, and as long as we stand, they'll never take it." He looked around at the people of Ironwood, who were already beginning to clean up, to tend to the wounded, to rebuild. This battle might have been won, but the war was far from over. There would always be threats, new enemies, new forces, but Ironwood had proven it could face whatever came next. As the sun rose over Ironwood, Walter stood at the edge of town, looking out at the horizon. The battle had been fierce, but it had also been a turning point. The Silent Hand had learned the hard way that Ironwood was not a place to be taken lightly. Ironwood was a place of resistance, a place where people stood together to protect what was theirs. Ironwood was no longer just a town. It was a symbol of defiance, of strength, and of the unwavering spirit of its people. And as long as Walter Hayes was here, Ironwood would never fall. If you enjoyed this story, please leave your comment below and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel where your support means the world to us. We look forward to bringing you more content that inspires growth, joy, and purpose. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you tomorrow for another special story.